Imagine a name written into history and then erased, not lost to time, not forgotten in the chaos of war, but deliberately scrubbed away by the very hands that had written it into power. Such is the strange, almost dreamlike arc of Konstantin Rokossovsky's life, a man who rose to command armies, who was then unmade by the machinery of state, and who would have to be made again, restored piece by fractured piece, his reputation returning to him only when his nation most desperately needed the gift of his mind. On a particular winter night in Poland, sometime in the late 1930s, trains still ran through the snow, carrying soldiers and officers to distant postings. Those wheels turning on frozen rails, that distant rhythmic percussion of iron on iron, echoed through countless quiet towns. In such a town, in such a night, there may well have been a young officer looking out at the white landscape, unaware that his name would soon vanish from official records, that he would be swallowed into darkness, that he would, against all probability, emerge from it. The question that invites us into his story is deceptively simple. How does a man survive when his own government decides he no longer exists? And perhaps more profoundly, when he is finally called back from that invisible exile, can he truly forgive the hands that thrust him into it? If you find yourself drawn into the untold journeys of history's quietest commanders, those men whose names were hidden and then revealed, whose acts of brilliant, patient strategy saved millions and cost them everything, we invite you to subscribe to Fall Asleep, where we illuminate the complete hidden histories of World War II's most fascinating minds through calm, deeply researched narratives designed to carry you gently into sleep. Let us begin, then, by stepping back into an earlier time, before the snow, before the trains, before the silence. The Poland of the 1890s was not a Poland that appeared on maps. It existed as a geographical and cultural memory, divided among three empires, German, Austrian, and Russian, each claiming their portion of the land and its people. In the western quarters, in Warsaw, a city pressed between the Russian occupation and the ghost of Polish independence, a child was born into this fractured, uncertain world. His mother was Russian, his father was Polish, and in that simple fact of his birth lay the seed of a lifelong tension. A man with two homelands is sometimes a man with none. The boy's early years unfolded in the texture of urban poverty and the strange pride that attends it. His father was a cavalry officer in the Tsar's service, a profession that carried both rank and humiliation in occupied Poland, a man who served a foreign crown in his own land. The household knew discipline. It knew the careful management of modest means. It knew, too, a certain remove from ordinary life, the isolation that comes when your father wears the uniform of an occupier in the eyes of your neighbors. And then the child's world fractured again. His father died. We do not know the exact circumstances that surrounded this loss. History is sometimes merciful in obscuring the minor tragedies that haunt private lives. But we know that young Konstantin found himself, at an age when boys still require a father's presence, without one. He was left in the care of his mother, in a city that was itself orphaned, a place without a nation, a boy without the anchor that a father provides. What emerges from this sparse biographical detail is a pattern that would define his character through decades: adaptation, the capacity to take what was broken and make something whole from it, to find discipline in chaos, to find order in loss. The Russian schooling that he received was careful and rigorous. He was taught the language of power, Russian, and he was taught the bearing of authority. But he was also taught something else, something quieter, the virtue of observation. A boy of divided blood learns to watch both sides. He learns to listen before speaking. He learns the value of patience in a world that does not quite know what to do with him. There were horses, too, in these early memories. Poland's plains and the Russian cavalry tradition created a culture in which horsemanship was not merely a skill, but a language of the body, a way of understanding grace and power and the patient discipline required to unite a man with an animal. Young Rokossovsky spent his childhood in the orbit of cavalry life, and though we must be cautious about imposing metaphor onto historical fact, it is worth noting that horses would follow him throughout his life, not as symbol, but as the literal instrument of his early military education. By the time he reached adolescence, a question was forming in him, though perhaps he could not have named it clearly. What did it mean to be a soldier? What did it mean to serve? These were not abstract philosophical questions for a boy of his circumstances. They were practical inquiries into the only path of advancement available to him. A boy without great wealth, without political connection, without the blessing of a living father. Such a boy becomes a soldier because the army is the one institution that will take him and ask only for his obedience and his intellect. The wider world was shifting. The Tsar's power in Russia was beginning to show cracks. The revolution that would reshape everything was still years away, but history moves on currents that ordinary people cannot yet see. The young man who would become Rokossovsky was growing up in a place and time where the old order was dying, and he could not have known, standing in Warsaw or later in Russian military schools, that he would not merely witness that death, but be shaped by it, tested by it, nearly consumed by it, and then released to save his nation from something even darker. The discipline that his childhood had instilled in him was a gift, though he would not fully understand its value until it became his only armor. The divided loyalty of his blood, Russian and Polish, would haunt him with a complexity that few men of his generation had to bear. But it would also grant him an unusual form of vision, the ability to see both the logic of power and the cost of power, to understand that systems are built by men and therefore can be questioned by men. For now, though, he was simply a young officer in training, riding horses across fields, learning the vast Russian landscape, beginning to understand the weight of the uniform he was learning to wear. The snow was just snow, the trains were just trains. His name, for the moment, was still his own. The long night of the Great Purge was still years away, though perhaps, in the way that sensitive souls sometimes feel the approach of winter, there was already in the air a premonition of the darkness that was coming. If you find yourself drawn to these quiet, untold corners of history, to the men whose names were erased and then painstakingly restored, to the choices made in darkness that shaped the fate of nations, then perhaps you might consider joining us on this journey. We have gathered, over months of careful research and reflection, a collection of deeply documented narratives exploring the hidden lives of the Second World War's greatest commanders. The stories we tell here are not the ones you'll find in hurried textbooks or shallow documentaries. Instead, we move slowly through the evidence, through letters and memoirs and the patient testimonies of those who knew these men, to understand not just what they did, but who they were when no one was watching. Each episode is crafted with the same intention that guides this one, to create a space where you might learn something true about history, while allowing your mind the gentleness it deserves at the end of your day. There is something profoundly different about encountering these narratives in a place of calm and stillness, rather than in the bright glare of urgency. The complexity of a man like Rokossovsky, his contradictions and his quiet courage, reveals itself more fully when you are not rushing, and there are others waiting in the wings of this documentary archive. Commanders whose struggles and triumphs deserve the same patient, tender attention. Consider, as you move forward into this account of one soldier's imprisonment and redemption, that you might return to us for more of these stories. We explore the lives of those who served under impossible circumstances, who made decisions that echoed across continents, who carried the weight of history in ways that history books seldom fully capture. The arc of a single life, examined with care and without haste, can teach us far more about courage and compromise, about loyalty and the limits of human endurance, than any quick recounting ever could. There is a particular rhythm to this kind of learning, one where the listener and narrator move together through time, where each detail accumulates like snow on a winter landscape, building a picture that is both historically precise and deeply human. We have dedicated ourselves to this approach because we believe that your time, your attention, and your rest are worthy of nothing less than the most careful craftsmanship and the most authentic voices we can offer. So we invite you, gently and without pressure, to subscribe to this channel so that you might return whenever the world feels too bright or too loud, whenever you need to step into another century and another life, whenever you wish to understand the hidden architecture of the events that shaped our own age. The commanders are waiting. Their stories have waited decades to be told with this kind of care, and there will always be a place here, in this quiet space, for you to listen and to rest. Now, let us return to Poland, to the snow, and to the boy who would one day become a general. The boy who would become Konstantin Rokossovsky arrived in Warsaw on the 23rd of December 1896, born into a family caught between two empires and belonging fully to neither. His father, Ksawery Wikentowicz Rokossovsky, was a Polish railway official of modest means, descended from Lithuanian nobility that had long since faded into the rhythm of ordinary work and quiet subsistence. His mother, Antonina Vasilievna, carried Russian blood and Orthodox faith, a woman of gentler temperament whose presence would, by all accounts, shape something tender in a boy destined for war. They named him Konstantin, a name that bridged both worlds, neither wholly Polish nor wholly Russian. Much like the child himself, would always be caught between two identities, two nations, two visions of what a man could become. Warsaw in the 1890s was a city of amber gas lamps and vast melancholic streets, governed by the Russian Empire but inhabited by a Polish spirit that could never quite be extinguished. The Rokossovsky household was not wealthy. There was no grand mansion, no servants, no sense of inherited power or ancient privilege waiting to unfold. Instead, there was the quiet dignity of people who worked for their bread, who moved through the world with a kind of unassuming discipline, who understood that life was something you endured rather than celebrated. This was Konstantin's first education, not written in any book, but absorbed through daily routine, through his father's careful attention to duty, through the way his mother managed a small household with what little they had. But this delicate domestic world could not hold. When Konstantin was 5 years old, the thread that bound his family together was severed. His mother, Antonina, fell ill and died, leaving a young boy without the softness that might have tempered the harsher lessons the world had to teach. It is perhaps one of the quiet tragedies of his early life that we know so little of how he grieved, of what memories of her voice or touch remained in him as he grew older. His father, now a widower, had a son to raise alone, and the railroads of Warsaw would claim most of his attention. Little Konstantin became, in some very real sense, an orphan, not abandoned, never that, but rather left to find his own way through the spaces between routine and affection. Perhaps it was this loss that began to shape in him a certain emotional reserve, a quality that would mark his entire character. There are children who grieve openly and demand comfort, and there are children who withdraw, who watch others, who learn to need very little and to offer their loyalty quietly to those who show them consistency. Rokossovsky seems to have been of the second kind. Without a mother's constant presence, without the density of family ritual and embracing, he turned his attention outward, to the world of the household servants, to the streets of Warsaw, to the things he could observe and understand through patient attention rather than through emotional expression. His father remarried when Konstantin was still young, and the boy acquired a stepmother whose name, like so much of his early life, has dissolved into historical silence. The relationship between them was apparently cordial enough, neither warm nor hostile, suggesting a boy who had learned early not to demand more than was offered, and a stepmother who managed a second marriage with the same practical efficiency that characterized so much of Russian provincial life. There is something almost poignant in imagining this quiet arrangement, a man grieving his lost wife, a boy learning to live without maternal comfort, a woman attempting to hold together a household that had already been fractured by loss. Love, if it existed among them, was the practical, undemonstrative kind that required no words and offered no excessive gestures. By the time Konstantin was 12 or 13, his father made a decision that would alter the entire trajectory of his life. The railways of the Russian Empire required skilled men, and the family relocated eastward, away from Warsaw's amber lamps, and toward the interior of Russia itself. The boy left behind the Polish streets where he had learned to speak both Polish and Russian, where his hybrid identity had at least made some kind of sense, and entered a world that was far more rigidly Russian, far less forgiving of those who did not quite belong. It was in Russia proper that young Rokossovsky encountered something that would speak to him more powerfully than any person had since his mother's death. He encountered the cavalry. In the towns and garrison cities of Russia, where military tradition ran deep as ancient stone, the cavalry represented something almost mystical, a tradition of horsemanship that stretched back across centuries, a bond between man and animal that required patience, skill, and a kind of quiet communication that had nothing to do with words. For a boy who had learned to love through observation rather than embrace, who had learned to find discipline in routine and comfort in the predictable, the horse offered something extraordinary. It offered a language he could speak without vulnerability. The young Konstantin spent what hours he could among the cavalry posts, watching the soldiers work, studying the way men moved around horses, absorbing the rhythms of the stable and the riding ground with the same patient attention he had turned toward everything else in his life. It is one of those biographical moments that sometimes carries more truth than all the documented facts combined. A boy discovering that his deepest instincts could be channeled through something larger than himself, through tradition, and through the relationship between a man and a powerful animal that could only be commanded through respect, precision, and an almost wordless understanding. The cavalry world offered structure without suffocation, discipline without cruelty if practiced rightly, and a clear hierarchy where competence mattered and sentiment did not. His father, observing these inclinations, made another crucial decision. Rather than allow his son to drift into the uncertain world of provincial Russia, he would offer him the one thing that might secure his future: military training. In 1912, at the age of 15, Konstantin Rokossovsky entered the St. Petersburg Imperial Cavalry School, one of Russia's most prestigious military academies. This was not a gift of wealth, not really. It was a gift of connection and foresight, a father understanding that in Russia, as in most empires, the military offered a path upward for those without inherited privilege. It was a calculated kindness, the kind of thing a parent does when they understand that love is sometimes best expressed through opening doors rather than through warmth. The academy itself existed in that last, shimmering moment of Imperial Russia, just before the world would shatter completely. The school taught classical cavalry tactics refined over generations, the art of command through presence and respect, the philosophy that an officer was not merely a military functionary, but a gentleman, someone whose bearing and knowledge would inspire others to follow through example. This education, offered in those final years before revolution, would prove both a gift and a curse. It instilled in Rokossovsky principles about command and loyalty that were wholly at odds with what the future would demand. And yet these same principles would somehow sustain him through the very worst chaos the 20th century could produce. In the academy, the young cadet from Warsaw discovered something else. He discovered that he had a gift not just for horsemanship, but for understanding how men could be organized and motivated. His classmates noted that he was thoughtful rather than flashy, more likely to ask a careful question than to offer a bright answer. The kind of officer in training who seemed to understand that the point of military science was not to display one's own brilliance, but to ensure that the men under your command could function as a coherent whole. This was not the style of the moment. In the golden, doomed world of the Imperial Army, glory was still something to be chased, bravery was still seen as individual audacity, and the old models of cavalry heroism still held romantic sway. But Rokossovsky, shaped by orphaning and hardship and the patient discipline of his early life, seemed to sense something different. He seemed to sense that war was a problem to be solved through calculation and care rather than through passion and impulse. The boy who had lost his mother, who had crossed the boundary between Poland and Russia, as if crossing between two possible selves, who had found in horses a language more reliable than human speech, this boy was becoming something remarkable. He was becoming the kind of officer who would look at a battle not as an opportunity for glory, but as a geometric problem to be solved. He was becoming the kind of leader who would remember that every calculation of tactics was ultimately a calculation about how many men would live and how many would die. And all of this was still ahead of him, still unwritten, still contained in the quiet promise of a young man who had learned, in the hardest possible way, that life demanded discipline, attention, and the willingness to endure whatever came without complaint or excessive hope. The years unfolded slowly in those early decades of the 20th century, and young Konstantin Alexievich found himself, like so many boys of his station, caught between the fading world of his childhood and the quickening demands of a world that would not wait for him to be ready. His mother's death, already a shadow across his early years, had left him tethered to practical necessity, to work, to survival, to the quiet calculations of a boy who understood, perhaps too young, that the world owed him nothing and that softness was a luxury he could not afford. It was in these formative years that the shape of his character began to crystallize, not through grand intention, but through the simple, repetitive acts of daily labor. He took work where he could find it, moving between jobs with the resilience of someone for whom stability was never a given. There was a quality to this period, a kind of patient acceptance that would later define his entire approach to leadership. He was learning, without anyone teaching him explicitly, the value of endurance. He was learning how to observe, how to listen, how to move quietly through a world that often overlooked him. But within that quiet boy, there burned something that set him apart from the merely downtrodden. There was a restlessness too, a hunger that was not merely for bread or shelter, though those mattered deeply, but for something less tangible, for meaning perhaps, for a sense of purpose that transcended the narrow confines of poverty. And it was this hunger that drew him, as so many young men of that era were drawn, toward the mounted cavalry. There is something profound about a young man discovering horses. It is an encounter that seems to speak to something ancient and wordless within us, some remnant of our most primal selves that recognizes in the horse a nobility, a strength, a freedom that feels achingly out of reach. For Rokossovsky, this encounter was not simply romantic, though it carried that quality, but something far more deliberate. A cavalry regiment offered not only employment but a pathway. It offered training, it offered structure, it offered, quite simply, a way forward when forward seemed impossibly distant. We must imagine him in those early moments, perhaps around 1909 or 1910, when he first began to orient himself toward the cavalry. He was still a young man, perhaps in his late teens or very early 20s, still bearing the marks of his earlier struggles, but there was something in his bearing already, a kind of natural discipline, a respect for order and hierarchy that came not from any aristocratic upbringing, but from his own hard-won understanding of how the world worked. The cavalry attracted men like him, men of modest means who understood that discipline and horsemanship could be a kind of alchemy, transforming them from simple laborers into something with status, with identity, with a clear place in the military hierarchy. The cavalry regiments of the Russian Empire at that time occupied a peculiar cultural space. They were repositories of romantic idealism, yes, but also of brutal realism. A cavalry officer rode horses that cost more than a laborer's annual wage. He maintained them, groomed them, understood their temperament and needs with the kind of intimacy that bordered on the spiritual. And in learning to do this, in learning to move in concert with an animal far larger and more powerful than himself, a young man learned things about himself, about balance, about quiet communication, about the impossible dance between domination and cooperation. Rokossovsky seems to have taken to this world with a natural ease that suggests something more than mere ambition. There are hints, in the fragmented historical records we possess, that he possessed what one might call an intuitive gift with horses, not merely the technical competence that could be taught and drilled, but something more mysterious, an ability to read the subtle shifts in mood and movement, an understanding, almost unspoken, of how to ask something difficult of an animal without cruelty, without breaking its will. This would later become a defining characteristic of his approach to leadership, that same quality of asking much while respecting the humanity, or in this case, the animal nature, of those under his command. What strikes us most forcefully, as we contemplate this period of his youth, is how the cavalry became not merely a profession, but a lens through which he began to understand himself. The discipline required to maintain a cavalry horse, to care for it, to ride with precision and purpose, imposed upon him a kind of contemplative rigor. There were no shortcuts in horsemanship. You could not merely wish to be a good rider. You had to practice, repeatedly, with full attention. You had to develop a sensitivity to subtle cues. You had to learn to move as one with something vast and powerful, or you would fall. These lessons would echo through every subsequent phase of his life. By the time the first months of 1914 arrived, Rokossovsky had already begun the process of ascending through the non-commissioned ranks. He had proven himself capable, reliable, skilled. The cavalry life had given him something his earlier years had not, a sense of belonging, a clear measure of his own worth, a structure within which his natural abilities could flourish. Yet he remained, in temperament, the same quiet boy who had labored for his bread. He was not flashy. He did not seek attention. He simply performed his duties with exactitude and allowed his competence to speak for itself. There is something we must observe about these pre-war years, something that often remains unexamined when we look at the great military commanders of history. We tend to assume that their eventual greatness was always somehow apparent, that there were signs, portents, clear indications of the titans they would become. But the truth is far more subtle. Rokossovsky was, in these years, simply a competent cavalry soldier. There was nothing to suggest that he would one day command armies. There was nothing to hint at the scale of his eventual importance. What was present, rather, was something more elusive, a kind of quiet steadiness, a capacity to learn from every experience, a humility that paradoxically grew stronger, not weaker, with every small success. He was, in short, becoming the kind of man who, when great circumstances arrived, would be prepared to meet them, not because he had been training for greatness, but because he had simply trained himself to be excellent at whatever task lay before him. And so the spring of 1914 approached, and Europe stood on the precipice of an abyss it did not fully comprehend. The cavalry regiments of the Russian Empire would soon ride toward purposes none of them could fully imagine, and a young officer named Rokossovsky, hardened by poverty, shaped by discipline, made wise by horses and hard work, would ride with them. He would ride not knowing that this war, and the revolutions that would follow it, would test him in ways that would seem, in these peaceful pre-war months, utterly unimaginable. The world tilted toward catastrophe in the summer of 1914, and in the vast Russian Empire, the machinery of mobilization ground to life with a sound like distant thunder. For Rokossovsky, now a young man of 23, the outbreak of war arrived not as a distant news story, but as a direct summons. He had spent his formative years moving between Russia and his Polish heritage, learning horses as others learned languages, understanding the rhythm of cavalry drill as a form of meditation. When the call came to enlist, he answered it almost without hesitation, as if something in him had always been preparing for this exact moment. Picture the Eastern European theatre in those early months of the First World War. The Russian army, vast and hungry and often poorly equipped, hurled itself against the German and Austro-Hungarian forces with a kind of desperate courage. Rokossovsky entered this chaos as a junior officer in the cavalry, that ancient branch of warfare that was already becoming obsolete, though few would admit it at the time. Machine guns and barbed wire and artillery were rewriting the rules of battle, yet the cavalry still charged, still believed in the power of speed and horseback skill and the thunder of hooves across open ground. There was something almost dreamlike about it, as if the 19th century were refusing to surrender to the 20th, and young officers like Rokossovsky found themselves riding toward trenches and guns with saber drawn. What becomes clear from the historical record, fragmentary though it sometimes is that Rokossovsky possessed something that training manuals could not teach. In those early skirmishes across the borderlands of Poland and Russia, amid the fog of movement and sudden contact with enemy patrols, he demonstrated a quality that his comrades would later describe as an uncanny ability to read the terrain and anticipate his opponent's movements. Whether this arose from his childhood on horses or from some deeper well of intuition, he seemed to understand instinctively how to position his small unit to maximum effect. It was not recklessness, but rather a kind of calm calculation wrapped in the guise of action. The details of specific cavalry engagements blur across the decades, as they often do in accounts of the First World War. Unit records were sometimes lost, personal narratives were colored by memory and emotion, and the sheer scale of the conflict made minor skirmishes seem insignificant at the time. Yet the pattern that emerges from various sources is consistent enough. Rokossovsky gained a reputation for competence and for a certain restraint unusual among officers of his age and background. He did not waste men unnecessarily. He did not throw his cavalry at fortified positions where horses had no chance. Instead, he seemed to understand that an officer's job was not merely to display courage, but to preserve his unit's strength while accomplishing the mission, a philosophy that was gaining ground among the more thoughtful commanders of the war, even as it often clashed with the broader military culture of frontal assault and attrition. There is something worth pausing on here, something that perhaps speaks to the man he would become. In the chaos of the First World War, with millions dying in trenches and the old certainties of imperial warfare crumbling into mud and blood, what distinguished an average officer from a natural leader? It was partly tactical sense, yes, but it was also something more subtle, a capacity to maintain composure when circumstances were frightening and uncertain. Rokossovsky seemed to possess this in abundance. Even as a young subaltern, he carried himself with a kind of quiet authority, a steadiness that reassured men under his command that they were being led by someone who thought carefully before acting. His rank advanced during the war, as did his experience. By 1916, as the Great War ground into its third year, Rokossovsky had been promoted to captain, and his reputation continued to grow in modest but significant ways. He survived wounds, recovered, and returned to duty. He participated in operations across the western Russian frontier, in the Carpathian campaigns, in the swirling movements that characterized warfare in Eastern Europe during this period, where fronts were longer and more fluid than in France, where cavalry sometimes still had room to maneuver, where an officer with good judgment and steady nerves could sometimes achieve something memorable. What is perhaps most intriguing about this period of his life is how utterly unlike the stereotype of a Russian cavalry officer he was becoming. There was no dashing flamboyance, no theatrical heroism designed to impress superiors. Instead, there was an almost German-like attention to detail, a methodical approach to planning, a respect for the capabilities of enemy forces that bordered on the philosophical. Had he been serving in the German or Austro-Hungarian armies, such qualities might have seemed entirely natural. In the Russian context, where bravery was often defined by sacrifice and clan loyalty rather than careful calculation, Rokossovsky represented something subtly different. Perhaps this was his Polish heritage asserting itself, or perhaps it was simply his temperament, forged in a childhood without privilege or pretension. Whatever its source, it was already shaping him into an officer who thought differently about how war ought to be conducted. The Great War, of course, transformed not only Rokossovsky, but the entire world around him. By 1917, as Russian power crumbled and revolution swept the empire, the old order, the imperial army, the cavalry as a means of warfare, the very concept of hierarchy and obedience that had defined military life, was about to be swept away entirely. Rokossovsky found himself not merely a soldier trying to survive a terrible war, but a man standing at the threshold of a new historical era. The war that had forged him as a leader was coming to an end, and the choice he would make in the chaos that followed would define everything that came after. When the old Romanov order began to crack, sometime in those first months of 1917, when the sound of the war had already hollowed so many Russian hearts, Rokossovsky found himself standing at one of those quiet moments that shapes a life. He was perhaps 30 years old by then. He had seen enough of combat on the Western Front to know that courage alone, the simple charge on horseback, the willingness to die for an empire, had become something almost quaint. The world was changing in ways that could not be undone, and like many soldiers of his generation, he felt the old certainties beginning to slip away beneath his feet. The revolution, when it came, arrived not as a single thunderclap, but as a slow gathering roar. Petrograd exploded first in the winter cold, and then the fever spread across the vast body of Russia like the breaking of ice on a river in spring. The Tsar abdicated. The old aristocratic officer corps found themselves suddenly bereft of the order that had given their lives meaning. Some fled westward into exile, some clung to the fragments of authority that remained, and some, like Rokossovsky, began to wonder whether this upheaval might offer something new, something that could be built rather than merely inherited. There is a question, perhaps one without a final answer, about what drew him toward the Bolsheviks. He was not a man of ideology in the way that some were. He did not spend his evenings reading Lenin or debating the nature of the coming proletarian state. But he was also not indifferent to the suffering he had witnessed. He had seen peasant soldiers die for objectives they did not understand, for generals who regarded their lives as mere resources to be spent. He had seen the villages of the western frontier stripped bare to feed an army that seemed to have no end. And he had felt, perhaps, the same kind of yearning that moved through the whole of Russia in those months, a sense that if the old world was truly gone, then the new one being born, whatever its promises and perils, might at least be built on something truer. The Bolsheviks, whatever their methods and whatever one might think of them now, offered a vision of order and purpose. They offered a framework, a way to channel the chaos into something directed. For a military man like Rokossovsky, trained in discipline and the logistics of command, this had its appeal. The revolution had not destroyed the need for armies. It had only transformed them, and so, when the moment came to choose, he chose to offer his skills to the new Soviet state. The decision was not made in isolation. Many of the old Tsarist officers, the professional military men who had spent their lives in service, made similar choices in those years. The Bolsheviks, despite their revolutionary rhetoric, needed the expertise of those who had studied war as a craft, and Rokossovsky possessed something the early Red Army desperately lacked: a deep, almost intuitive knowledge of how to move troops across terrain, how to position cavalry, how to think in the language of maneuver and timing. These were not ideological skills. They were the accumulated understanding of a career soldier, and they would be essential for survival. What followed were the years of the Russian Civil War, and these were years of a particular kind of chaos, one that belonged perhaps to that moment alone in history. The Red Army was being formed almost from nothing, assembled from the remnants of the Imperial Army, from revolutionary volunteers, from soldiers who had simply decided that the Bolsheviks offered a better path than the white armies gathering against them. There was no clear line of battle, no stable front. Instead, there was an almost liquid conflict spreading across the vast territories of Siberia and southern Russia and the Ukraine, a war that moved and shifted with a kind of terrible fluidity. Rokossovsky found himself in the east, in the terrible distances of Siberia, where the winters could freeze a man's thoughts inside his skull. He served in the cavalry, still, because the cavalry was what he knew. And in Siberia, far from the centers of power, far from Moscow and Petrograd, he had the space to think as a military man thinks, to make decisions based on the movement of troops and the geography of the land, rather than on political calculation. This is perhaps one of the reasons he survived the chaos of those years as well as he did. He was not a revolutionary ideologue, he was a soldier, and in the confusion of the Civil War, that distinction, that clarity of purpose, kept him alive and relatively whole. The conditions were almost beyond description. The Red and White armies swept back and forth across Siberia, and the civilian population caught between them endured horrors that would be difficult for someone living in peace to fully imagine. Supplies were scarce. Food was a constant anxiety. Officers learned to improvise, to make do with what they had, to achieve the impossible with nothing. Rokossovsky developed in those years a quality that would define him throughout his life, a capacity to remain calm and methodical even as everything around him dissolved into confusion and despair. He was not unfeeling, he was not indifferent to the suffering, but he had learned to compartmentalize those feelings, to set them aside so that he could focus on the immediate problem of keeping his men alive and achieving whatever objective had been given to him. By the time the Civil War ended, sometime around 1922, the fighting had exhausted itself across vast distances, and the Bolsheviks had emerged as the victors, bloodied and transformed by what they had endured. Rokossovsky had done his part in that victory. He had earned a certain respect among his peers, a reputation for competence and steadiness. He was not yet famous. The great commanders of the Civil War had their names known across the new Soviet Union, but Rokossovsky was known to those who mattered, to those who understood the craft of warfare and could recognize when a man possessed the deep, almost silent kind of talent that war requires. And so he moved into the peace that followed, a peace that was never quite complete, never quite stable, but at least a peace in which armies were not actively hunting one another across frozen steppes. He had made his choice during the Revolution and the Civil War. He had cast his lot with the Bolsheviks, with this new, uncertain experiment in building a different kind of state and a different kind of army. Whether that choice was right or wise, whether it would prove to be a decision that would save him or ultimately betray him, was still a question whose answer lay entirely in the future, waiting in the darkness ahead, like something not yet named. The years that followed the Civil War's end found Rokossovsky in a peculiar stillness, a kind of earned peace that seemed almost unnatural after the violence and chaos of those grinding campaigns across Siberia's frozen expanse. Around 1921, as the dust of revolution began to settle into something resembling order, he was posted to various cavalry units across the Soviet territories, and it was during these quieter postings that the rough soldier began to reveal something gentler underneath, a man who had learned to command not merely through the authority of rank, but through a kind of careful attention to those under his care. The cavalry remained his truest love, and in those early Soviet years, the horse still mattered deeply in warfare, still held a romantic place in the imagination of commanders who had grown up in an era when cavalry ruled certain kinds of battlefields. What emerged during this decade was a commander distinctly different from many of his contemporaries. While other officers, burnished by the Civil War's brutalities, seemed to carry that harshness forward into their peacetime commands, Rokossovsky developed a reputation for something almost anomalous in the Red Army of the 1920s, for fairness, for listening, for explaining his orders to his men rather than simply demanding obedience. It was, in some ways, a dangerous reputation to cultivate in an institution built on terror and absolute hierarchy, and yet his results were undeniable. His cavalry units were disciplined, loyal, and oddly well cared for in an army where logistics were perpetually neglected. His horses were groomed better, his men better fed where circumstances allowed, his training methods more thoughtful and methodical. Other commanders noticed this, and some admired it, though others, men of a harsher temperament, might have viewed such care for his soldiers with something approaching suspicion. In 1923, Rokossovsky married. Her name was Jeanne, a French woman of Ukrainian origin, and the marriage itself spoke to the kind of cosmopolitan impulse that the early Soviet Union, for all its revolutionary rhetoric, still contained in pockets and corners. Love, when it came to Rokossovsky, appears to have been genuine and grounding, a counterweight to the immensity of his professional life. They would have 2 children together, a daughter and a son, and these domestic anchors seemed to have given him a kind of steadiness, a reminder that life contained things beyond strategy and command. The relationship would endure through everything that followed, though everything that followed would test it beyond measure. Throughout the 1920s, as he moved through various postings and grew more senior, Rokossovsky's methods became increasingly refined and increasingly documented. He was a student of military theory, a reader of the classical commanders, Napoleon, Frederick the Great, but he approached these studies not with the fervent ideological bent that characterized some Soviet officers, but with a pragmatist's eye toward what actually worked. He began to develop what might be called a philosophy of command, though he never formalized it in any grand treatise. Instead, it existed in the way he treated his subordinates, in the clarity of his orders, in his insistence that officers understand not just what they were to do, but why they were to do it. This stood in stark contrast to the Soviet command tradition, which often treated junior officers as mere instruments of the will above them. By the late 1920s, Rokossovsky had risen to command increasingly important cavalry formations, and his reputation had spread throughout the Red Army's officer corps. He was known as a meticulous planner, a man who spent long hours studying terrain, who insisted on detailed reconnaissance, who believed that battles were often won or lost in the weeks of preparation that preceded them, not in the sudden clash of combat itself. He was also known as someone willing to shield his subordinates from some of the more absurd demands that came down from above, to interpret orders with a certain intelligent flexibility when the situation demanded it. In an army that was becoming increasingly ideological, increasingly prone to purges and betrayals, this kind of quiet independence was both an asset and a vulnerability. There is something almost poignant about this period of Rokossovsky's life, when he seemed to be ascending toward the kind of secure, respectable position that any professional soldier might dream of. He had survived the civil war, avoided the worst of the early internecine conflicts, established himself as a competent and respected officer. He had a family, a home, a reputation for excellence. The machinery of the state, though vast and sometimes terrifying, had not yet turned its attention toward him. He worked in a milieu, the cavalry, the provinces, that was somewhat removed from the factional struggles in Moscow's highest circles. He appears to have been content, or as content as a man of his temperament could be, focused on his work and on training the next generation of cavalry officers who would eventually become instrumental in the coming war. The 1920s were, in this sense, a kind of golden age for Rokossovsky, though he could not have known it. The photographs from this era show a man of settled middle age, still lean, still direct in his gaze, but no longer the hunted revolutionary or the desperate cavalry officer. There is a calmness to his face, a confidence born of competence and success. He had built something, not through ruthlessness or political maneuvering, but through genuine mastery of his craft. His men respected him because he was worthy of respect. His superiors recognized his abilities because they were evident in results. It seemed, in those quiet years between the chaos of revolution and the coming storm, as though he had found a kind of equilibrium. Yet the very qualities that had made him successful, his independence of mind, his refusal to bend to ideology when it conflicted with military necessity, his loyalty to his subordinates rather than to the machinery of power above, would soon become liabilities in an atmosphere that was rapidly becoming more paranoid, more demanding of absolute conformity, more willing to destroy excellence if excellence suggested any hint of disloyalty. The contentment of the 1920s, the sense of a life well lived and a reputation well earned, would soon be tested by forces that were already gathering in the shadows, forces that no amount of military brilliance or personal rectitude could withstand. But for now, as the decade drew toward its close, Rokossovsky was simply a successful officer, a loving husband and father, a man whose future seemed secure. By the 1920s, when Rokossovsky was climbing steadily through the ranks of the still young Red Army, the cavalry held a peculiar and almost sacred place in Soviet military imagination. It was not merely a branch of service. It was, in many ways, the last romantic echo of an older, more gallant world, a world of movement across open steppes, of horsemanship as an art form, of officers who understood their relationship with their mounts as something approaching a bond of trust. And yet, embedded within that romance lived something far darker, something born of the borderlands and the pitiless civil war that had only recently ended. To understand Rokossovsky fully, one must pause here and drift into the peculiar gravity of the Soviet cavalry tradition, because it shaped not only his hands and his eye, but his entire philosophy of command. The cavalry, you see, had never truly vanished from Russian military thought, even as the rest of the world was moving into an age of tanks and mechanization. Napoleon himself had relied on cavalry, and the Russians had learned from those encounters. The Cossacks, those fiercely independent warriors of the southern steppes, had been both the enemies and the occasional allies of the Tsarist state for centuries. When the Red Army was born from chaos in 1918, there was something deeply Russian about preserving the cavalry as a serious force. Not all sentiment, not all nostalgia. The cavalry could move fast. It could strike where wheels could not. It could turn on a moment when conditions demanded it. In the Civil War, cavalry units had chased white armies across seemingly endless distances. They had become legendary. And Rokossovsky, you might recall, had always loved horses. From his earliest years, the creature's intelligence had called to something in him that was more than simply practical. The cavalry regiments of the Red Army in the 1920s were organized with meticulous care. They were elite in their way. Recruitment was selective. Training was severe. A cavalry officer did not simply command from a desk. He lived with his men and his mounts in a relationship that demanded constant attention, constant vigilance, constant physical presence. The rider who cannot feel his horse's mood through the saddle, who cannot read the animal's fatigue or fear, is a poor officer indeed. And the discipline required to master horsemanship, to remain steady in the saddle hour after hour, to guide hundreds or thousands of animals in coordinated movement across difficult terrain, this demanded a particular kind of patience, a particular kind of focus that seemed to infuse itself into the entire personality of a cavalry officer. Rokossovsky would have understood this in his bones. When he assumed command of cavalry units in the late 1920s, witnesses noted something distinctive in his presence. He moved through his regiments, not with the harsh bellowing of some commanders, but with a kind of quiet observation. A man on horseback sees differently. The world slows, details matter. The dust on a soldier's uniform, the way a horse's neck is held, the state of the saddles and equipment, all of these things were visible to a cavalry officer in a way they might not have been to an infantry commander. There was, perhaps, something about being mounted on a living creature that encouraged a certain awareness of individual soldiers as living creatures too, rather than merely as units in a formation. The cavalry tradition also carried within it, however, a deep thread of violence and brutality. This cannot be softened or made pleasant, and so we mention it gently as we drift onward. The cavalry charges of the Civil War, and there were many, had been ferocious affairs. Horses, when driven at full gallop toward infantry positions, create panic through sheer physical force and terror. Sabers clashing against rifles, the screams of wounded animals, the blood on grass. The revolutionary cavalry units of the Red Army, building their reputation in those violent years, had earned their mystique through a willingness to use shock tactics without mercy. They had swept across Siberia. They had pursued enemies into snow and cold that broke both flesh and spirit. The cavalry tradition that Rokossovsky inherited was not, then, some gentle pastoral thing. It was an instrument of absolute commitment, even absolute ruthlessness when circumstances demanded it. What is curious, and perhaps what made Rokossovsky different from many of his contemporaries, was his apparent ability to hold both of these elements at once. The discipline, the observation, the respect for the individual soldier that seemed to come naturally from cavalry work, but also the capacity for severe action when circumstances demanded it. Some have suggested, though we cannot be certain, that the cavalry's code of honor, old-fashioned perhaps, tied to a world of mounted warriors and single combat, influenced his moral outlook. A cavalry officer might, in theory, know his enemies as individuals, might respect a worthy opponent. There was something in the cavalry tradition that resisted the anonymity of modern industrial warfare, even if modern warfare was increasingly making such codes irrelevant. In the later 1920s, the Soviet Union was obsessed with mechanization. The future, everyone understood, belonged to tanks and trucks and aircraft, and yet the cavalry was not abandoned. It lingered, preserved, perhaps sentimentally, but also pragmatically. It was inexpensive. It could operate in terrain where vehicles could not. It was fast, and there was something in the Soviet mind that valued horses as a connection to older, more fundamental truths about soldiering. A man on a horse, even with a rifle, was still a warrior in a more intimate sense than a man sitting in a tank. The romance of it pulled at the Soviet imagination, even as ideology insisted on industrialization. The cavalry regiments of the Red Army, in their dress uniforms, tall papaka hats, red piping, polished boots, were among the most visible and admired of Soviet military forces. They appeared in parades. They were photographed. They represented something about the vigor and tradition of the revolutionary state. And for an officer like Rokossovsky, who was building his reputation in this period, the cavalry offered a peculiar advantage. It was a place where traditional military virtue could still be displayed and valued. A cavalry commander could be observed directly by his men. There was no room for distant, impersonal command. He had to be present. He had to know what he was asking of both horses and soldiers. The horsemanship that Rokossovsky developed during these years was not mere mechanics. It was, in a sense, a language, the way a rider sits, the way he holds the reins, the way he moves through a column of cavalry. All of this communicates something to every soldier watching. Confidence or doubt, calm or anxiety, respect for the animals and men under command, or indifference to their welfare. The cavalry tradition then, in its fullest sense, was not really about horses at all. It was about the kind of officer a man became when he spent his formative years mounted, moving at the speed of a galloping animal, entirely dependent on his own balance and the trust of the creature beneath him. This might seem like a strange detour into the romantic world of horsemanship when we are discussing a Soviet general who would eventually command armies of millions, who would oversee the movement of tanks and artillery across hundreds of miles. And yet, something essential about Rokossovsky's character was forged in these cavalry years: the patience, the attention to detail, the ability to remain calm in chaos, the belief, perhaps, that a commander's first duty was to see his soldiers as individuals worthy of care. All of these things might have come from other sources, from other experiences, but the cavalry seems to have been the crucible in which they were combined and hardened into something distinctive. The Soviet cavalry, as it existed in the 1920s and early 1930s, was a world unto itself. A world where an officer could still believe, perhaps, in older codes of honor, where the relationship between a commander and his men could still be personal and direct, where violence, when it came, could be understood as a tragic necessity rather than as the impersonal operation of an industrial machine. The cavalry would not, of course, survive the coming war intact. Mechanization would accelerate. Horses would gradually disappear from the battlefields of Europe. But for the generation of officers that included Rokossovsky, the cavalry was the school in which they learned what it meant to command. And those lessons, patience, presence, care for those under command, readiness to act decisively when needed, would follow them into whatever future lay ahead, whether that future involved horses or not. By the mid-1930s, Konstantin Rokossovsky had begun to move through the world of Soviet command as a man for whom things were finally aligning. He was no longer the cavalryman scraping by on discipline and hope. He had become something more, a colonel, a voice in the planning rooms, a figure whose steady competence was noticed, whose tactical mind was trusted. His family, modest as it remained, was secure. His reputation, built across the long years since the revolution, seemed solid enough that he could allow himself, perhaps, a moment of quiet satisfaction. And then the purges began in earnest, and everything that had seemed solid became, overnight, gossamer thin. The Great Purge, as history would name it, was not something that announced itself with clarity or mercy. It did not arrive as a single, comprehensible disaster. Instead, it crept through the Soviet Union in waves, moving from department to department, from factory floor to military barracks, from science institute to civilian ministry, a spreading contagion of suspicion and fear that no one could quite predict and no one could escape. What had begun in 1936 as a purge of the old Bolshevik Guard, those revolutionary figures from the early years, the ones who remembered Lenin, the ones who might, theoretically, harbor doubts about Stalin's absolute rule, had metastasized into something far more vast and terrible. By 1937 and into 1938, the purge had become not a cleansing, but a systematic dismantling of an entire generation of Soviet leadership. The signal was simple. If you held position, if you held authority, if you had influence, if you had ever questioned anything or known anyone who had, you were vulnerable. The Red Army became a particular focus of this catastrophe. Perhaps Stalin felt, in his calculating and paranoid mind, that military men with independent command authority posed a special risk. Perhaps he had come to believe, after his years of consolidating power, that the generals and colonels and marshals were secretly plotting, secretly harboring old loyalties, secretly wondering if another form of governance might serve Russia better than his own. Or perhaps there was no logic to it at all. Perhaps it was simply the logical extension of totalitarian power, the requirement that everyone live in permanent fear, that no institution be allowed to develop its own coherence or confidence. Whatever the reason, the military became a cemetery of careers, a place where distinguished names simply vanished from the public record as if they had never existed. In 1937, Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, one of the most celebrated and innovative military commanders in all of Europe, was arrested on charges of treason. Tukhachevsky, a brilliant strategist, had been instrumental in modernizing Soviet military doctrine. He was executed within days, and his fall opened the floodgates. What followed was a cascade of arrests that would deplete the officer corps of roughly half its senior and mid-ranking commanders. 3 out of 5 marshals were shot. 13 out of 15 army commanders were executed or died in prison. The purges consumed generals and colonels, logistics officers and strategists, men who had fought in the revolution, men who had bled in the Civil War, men who had spent decades in service to the Soviet state. The machinery was relentless. An accusation would lead to an arrest. An arrest would lead, under torture and psychological pressure, to a confession. A confession would name other names. Those names would lead to more arrests. The web expanded in all directions, a geometry of destruction that fed on itself. In Rokossovsky's world, in the careful structure of command and trust that he had helped to build, the fear began to take on an almost physical presence. You went to work each morning, not knowing if your colleagues from yesterday would still be there. You heard rumors, whispers, the kinds of oblique warnings that circulated among officers when one of their own had been taken. Someone mentioned casually that a general he had worked with was gone, simply gone. Someone else disappeared from a meeting, and no one spoke his name again. The purges had a way of poisoning relationships. If your friend was arrested and accused of conspiracy, did that conspiracy include you? Had you discussed anything with him that might now be interpreted as suspicious? Had he, under torture, given your name? The safest response was to distance yourself, to cut off contact, to act as though the person had never existed. But in doing so, you participated in the destruction. Every silence made the next arrest easier. Rokossovsky, by most accounts, had maintained relationships carefully and had cultivated no powerful enemies. He had not been a vocal theorist or ideologue. He had not challenged Stalin's authority or made grand speeches about military doctrine that might be interpreted as criticism. He had been, instead, a quiet professional, a man who built, who planned, who executed orders with competence. Yet this, in a strange way, was no protection. No one was truly safe. The logic of the purges was not based on actual wrongdoing. It was based on a need for purification, for the removal of anyone who might potentially pose a risk, anyone who had connections to the wrong people, anyone who belonged to the wrong generation of commanders. In such an environment, survival was as much accident as character. In June of 1937, Rokossovsky was removed from his command. The specifics are somewhat murky, as they often are with Soviet military actions of this period, but the bare fact is stark. A man who had spent his entire adult life building toward authority, toward mastery, toward a position where he could serve his country with his full capabilities, was suddenly stripped of everything. He was brought in for questioning, and then, without warning, without trial, without any formal process that might offer explanation or recourse, he was placed under arrest. What precisely he was accused of remains unclear even now, decades later, in the declassified records of what has been preserved. The charges, like so many charges in the purges, were vague and fantastical. He was said to have connections to enemies of the state. He was said to be involved in a military conspiracy. He was said to harbor Polish sympathies, perhaps. The fact of his Polish heritage, which had never been hidden, which he had never hidden, could now be weaponized as evidence of disloyalty. The charges were whatever was necessary to justify his arrest and keep the machinery of the purge turning. And so Rokossovsky, at the age of 41, having spent 2 decades in service to the Soviet cause, having proven himself through the Civil War, through the difficult years of building the Red Army, through careful and conscientious command, found himself in a cell, stripped of his rank, his position, his freedom, and left to contemplate a future that offered no visible hope. The cell in Lubyanka was smaller than you might imagine, not a dungeon hewn from bedrock, but something more ordinary and somehow more terrible for its ordinariness, a room perhaps 12 feet by 8, with whitewashed walls that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the grey light filtering through a small frosted window set high near the ceiling. There was a cot, a bucket, a single bare bulb that burned continuously, day and night, erasing the mercy of darkness, erasing time itself until the prisoner lost all sense of whether he had been awake for hours or weeks. This was where Konstantin Rokossovsky found himself in the spring of 1937, as Stalin's Great Purge reached its crescendo and swept through the Red Army like a fever consuming healthy flesh. He had been arrested without warning, pulled from his duties by NKVD men in the pre-dawn hours. No charges were read, no explanation offered. The machinery of Soviet state security had simply decided his name belonged on a list, and now here he sat, a general stripped of his rank, a hero of the cavalry reduced to a number on an intake sheet, waiting in the silence for whatever interrogation would bring. The waiting itself was a form of torture. Hours accumulated into days. Food appeared at irregular intervals. Thin soup. Bread that seemed designed more for psychological effect than nutrition. The bulb never dimmed. Sleep, when it came at all, arrived in fragmentary snatches, impossible and unrefreshing, while the mind remained alert to every footfall in the corridor, every distant sound that might signal the opening of the door. When the interrogators finally came, they arrived with a peculiar courtesy that was somehow more unsettling than outright brutality. They wore uniforms and carried files thick with accusations. They pulled up a chair across from Rokossovsky and explained to him, almost reasonably, the evidence against him. He had been in contact with suspected enemies of the state. His record contained anomalies. Certain officers who had served under him had made statements, names were mentioned, confessions referenced, though the details remained conveniently vague. The message was implicit and clear. Others had already betrayed him. Why not simply cooperate? Why not sign the confessions they had prepared? It would go easier for him if he did. The technique was refined through years of practice. The Soviet secret police had learned that the most effective interrogation combined psychological pressure with the carefully cultivated suggestion that cooperation might lead to leniency, that resistance was futile because everyone else had already confessed. Files were opened before the prisoner showing photographs of colleagues, some of them genuine acquaintances, many of them strangers whose photographs had been gathered for this very purpose. The interrogator would tap the photograph and say, Almost conversationally, "This man has testified that you were part of a counter-revolutionary conspiracy. What do you say to that?" And in the silence that followed, the prisoner's mind would race through possibilities. Did he really know this person? Had some casual conversation been twisted into evidence? Who else might have spoken against him? The mind, deprived of sleep and proper nutrition, became unreliable, suggestible, prone to accepting the interrogator's premise rather than maintaining its own grip on truth. But Rokossovsky possessed something that many others did not. Perhaps it was the discipline instilled by years of military service. Perhaps it was some deeper well of conviction, some understanding that to confess to fabricated crimes was not merely to save one's own skin, but to validate the terror, to become a tool of the machine grinding through the army. Or perhaps, and this we can only glimpse through the fragmentary records that survived, it was a kind of stubbornness that ran through him like a vein of iron. He refused, not dramatically, not with heroic speeches, but with a quiet, consistent refusal to sign documents that accused him of crimes he had not committed. The interrogations intensified, the courtesy began to shed like old paint. There were threats more direct and personal. There was physical violence. Soviet prison records from this period, examined decades later by historians, suggest that Rokossovsky endured what was euphemistically called enhanced interrogation, beatings that were carefully calibrated to avoid permanent injury, or at least to avoid injury severe enough to be visible on an autopsy. The goal was confession, not death, though death often came anyway through less deliberate means. Despair, infection, starvation, the sheer relentlessness of the system's pressure. He was taken to interrogation sessions and shown lists of names of officers he knew. Some were already dead. Others were still imprisoned somewhere in this vast network of cells. "Sign here," the interrogators would say. "Admit that you were part of their conspiracy. Admit that you knew of their treason. Admit that you failed to report them." Each admission would link him further into a web of false accusations. Each signature would make him complicit in the destruction of others. How do we know what happened in those sessions? The Soviet state kept meticulous records, a bureaucratic obsession that inadvertently preserved the architecture of its own atrocities. Files were maintained, interrogation notes were filed, and after decades, some of these documents emerged, fragmentary and incomplete, but bearing the weight of authentic horror. We know that Rokossovsky was interrogated repeatedly. We know that there are gaps in the record, long periods where he simply disappeared from the documented world, and when he reappeared, he was thinner, his face changed, his health visibly altered. We know from his own words, spoken years later in careful, measured tones, that he had endured torture. He did not elaborate. He was not a man inclined toward dramatic recounting of suffering, but those few sentences, delivered with no trace of self-pity or bitterness, carried the weight of specific memory. The psychological campaign continued. If the interrogators could not break his resistance through physical means, perhaps they could through suggestion, through the slow poisoning of doubt. What if those colleagues he was protecting had already confessed to betraying him? What if, by remaining silent, he was merely prolonging his own torment while they went free? What if his silence meant nothing, changed nothing, while his cooperation might at least secure some small mercy, perhaps a quicker end or a lighter sentence? The mind, starved and sleepless, becomes susceptible to such logic. Thousands of Soviet officers confessed to conspiracies that never existed, to connections that were pure fabrication, to counter-revolutionary activities conducted entirely in the imaginations of their interrogators. But Rokossovsky held, whether through conviction, through fear of what such a confession would mean for others, or through some stubborn refusal to grant victory to those who had imprisoned him unjustly, he maintained his denial of the charges. He would not sign, he would not confess. The interrogators grew frustrated and, perhaps, impressed. He was moved to a different cell. The pressure intensified. Weeks became months. The calendar on his internal clock began to lose meaning. How long could a man endure this? How long before even the strongest will fractured? And yet something remarkable happened. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the character of the interrogations began to shift. The accusations became less insistent. The sessions grew shorter. The interrogators seemed, in an odd way, to lose interest. Was it possible that his very refusal, in a system built on compliance, had somehow registered as a kind of resistance too powerful to simply crush? Or was it bureaucratic accident, a shift in the priorities of the secret police, a movement of attention toward other prisoners who were more cooperative, more easily broken, more useful to the machinery of the purge? The silence that followed was almost as terrible as the violence that had preceded it. To be abandoned in a cell, to sense that your interrogators have moved on to other victims, is to understand that you have become, in some sense, forgotten. And yet there was also in that silence the smallest grain of hope, the realization that they had not destroyed him, that whatever they demanded he had not given it, that some core of himself remained intact, unyielding, preserved in the darkness like a seed waiting for spring that might never come. There exists a peculiar kind of silence that fills a prison cell in the depths of winter, especially in a place where the walls themselves seem designed to absorb not just sound, but hope itself. And it is into this silence that we now turn our attention, not to the facts of torture or interrogation, though those certainly occurred, but rather to the quieter, more profound struggle that took place within Rokossovsky's mind during those years in confinement. For it is often said that the greatest battles are not won with weapons or strategy, but rather in the solitary space between a man's thoughts and his will to endure. The human mind, researchers would later understand, possesses a remarkable capacity to construct protective chambers within itself when confronted with unbearable external circumstances. When the world outside becomes chaos, suspicion, and arbitrary cruelty, the inner world sometimes draws inward, becoming smaller, but also, paradoxically, more defined. Rokossovsky, a man trained from childhood to observe, to calculate, to remain composed under pressure, would have possessed certain advantages in this regard. His cavalry training had taught him discipline not merely of the body, but of attention itself. His years as a commander had schooled him in the management of fear within others, and by extension, within himself. Consider for a moment the particular torment of the accused innocent under a totalitarian system. It is not merely that one is imprisoned. It is that the very logic of the state suggests that if you are imprisoned, you must be guilty. Innocence becomes meaningless. The confession becomes the only currency of value. Yet to confess to crimes one did not commit is to betray something equally fundamental, the testimony of one's own memory, one's own conscience. It is to say that the state's truth matters more than your own, and for a man like Rokossovsky, a career soldier whose entire life had been organized around duty, honor, and the keeping of one's word, this represented not merely a threat to his freedom, but a threat to the very architecture of his identity. The interrogators, drawing their playbook from the methods perfected in those years, would have employed a calculated mixture of violence and psychological manipulation, the sleep deprivation, the sudden violence followed by false gentleness, the suggestion that comrades had already betrayed him, that his own name had been spoken in confessions, the implication that cooperation might lead to mercy, or at the very least, to a quicker end. These were not random cruelties, but systematic assaults on the prisoner's ability to maintain a coherent sense of self. And yet we find something curious in the historical record, though the details are necessarily sparse and sometimes contradictory. Rokossovsky, by most accounts, refused to betray those he had served with. He endured without breaking. But what does this endurance actually mean when we speak of it so quietly, so almost casually? What happens in the mind of a man who is beaten, deprived of sleep, told that his suffering is deserved, and yet who somehow maintains the refusal to speak untruths. Perhaps it begins with a kind of compartmentalization, a division of consciousness that allows the mind to observe its own suffering as if from a distance. One part of the self becomes the prisoner, the victim, the body that feels pain, but another part withdraws, becomes almost anthropological in its detachment. It watches, it notes, it remembers. This is not the same as not feeling pain. It is, rather, the coexistence of suffering and observation, of being immersed in horror while simultaneously maintaining a small, protected sanctuary of consciousness where the horror cannot fully penetrate. And then there is the matter of meaning. Humans, unlike perhaps any other creature, seem to possess an almost desperate need to find meaning in suffering. We cannot simply endure, we must endure for something. For Rokossovsky, even in the depths of this nightmare, there remained certain anchors. There was the knowledge that he had done nothing wrong, that the charges were fabrications. There was loyalty to those he refused to betray. There was, perhaps, an almost stubborn faith in the possibility of justice, even if that justice seemed infinitely distant. These were not rational consolations in any practical sense. They could not reduce the pain or shorten the imprisonment, but they could do something equally important. They could prevent the total annihilation of the self. The contemporary psychologists who would later study survivors of totalitarian imprisonment noted a curious phenomenon. Those who were most likely to maintain psychological coherence were often those who had developed, before their imprisonment, a strong sense of external purpose. They were engineers who could mentally design bridges. They were mathematicians who could solve problems in their heads. They were musicians who could compose symphonies from memory. They were soldiers who could mentally review campaigns, learn from them, improve upon them. In other words, they were people whose minds had been trained to construct and inhabit other worlds, and these internal worlds became refuges when the external world became unbearable. Rokossovsky would have occupied himself with strategy. There is every reason to believe that, in those dim cells, he was mentally fighting battles, replaying cavalry charges, considering the lessons of the Civil War, perhaps even imagining future campaigns in a Russia freed from the paranoia of the purges. Not out of hope that these thoughts would come to anything, but because thinking them was itself a form of resistance. To continue to think like a soldier, like a strategist, like an officer, was to refuse the state's attempt to reduce him to nothing but a victim, an accused, a broken man confessing to crimes he did not commit. And consider, too, the strange paradox at the heart of refusal under such circumstances. By refusing to confess, Rokossovsky was prolonging his own suffering. Every day that passed without a confession was, in theory, a day that his interrogators could intensify their methods, could increase his pain. The rational choice, from the perspective of self-preservation, would have been to give them what they wanted. And yet there exists a form of courage that operates in this space, a refusal that emerges not from strength but from a kind of ultimate weakness, transformed into something unbreakable. To refuse is to accept the likelihood of greater pain. To refuse is to take responsibility for that acceptance. There is a dignity in this that the state cannot touch, because it emerges from within, from the small protected core of self that remains intact, even when the body is broken. It is worth noting that we cannot know with absolute certainty the exact psychological experience of Rokossovsky during his imprisonment. The historical record provides us with fragments, with the fact of his refusal to falsely confess, with the testimony of others who were imprisoned alongside him or who emerged later from the same system. It is from these fragments that we attempt to reconstruct, gently and carefully, what his inner life might have been like. We move in the realm of educated speculation, always mindful that reality was likely both more complex and more terrible than what we can imagine. But what we can say with confidence is this: the capacity to endure totalitarian imprisonment while maintaining one's integrity is not a superhuman power. It is rather the result of the intersection of several human capacities: discipline, faith, the ability to construct meaning, loyalty, and perhaps most importantly, a kind of stubborn refusal to grant the state the final authority over one's own consciousness. These capacities can be learned, they can be developed, and Rokossovsky, through his entire life up to that point, had been cultivating them. In the darkness of those cells, in the isolation of confinement, he was not merely surviving. He was maintaining the possibility of a self that could emerge later and continue its purpose. He was refusing the state's narrative of his own worthlessness, and in this very small way, in this way that had no practical consequence at the time, he was resisting. Not with weapons or words, but with the simple, extraordinary act of continuing to believe that he remained himself, that his memory was real, that loyalty had meaning, and that perhaps, in some distant and unforeseeable future, justice and truth might prevail. This meditation on endurance, on the psychology of surviving in a system designed to destroy the self, brings us now to the threshold of unexpected deliverance. For imprisonment, as all-consuming as it seems, does eventually end, and what awaits on the other side is not resurrection, but rather a kind of fragile, complicated return to a world that has not stopped moving, that has not paused to wait for the vindication of the innocent. In the winter of 1940, something peculiar and almost miraculous began to unfold in the Soviet detention apparatus. The machinery of fear that had consumed so many had, for reasons that historians still piece together carefully, begun to reverse itself. Konstantin Rokossovsky, prisoner number 432 in Butyrka prison, had endured nearly 2 years in a cell, had suffered interrogations that broke bones and minds alike, and had watched other officers around him either confess to phantoms or disappear into the even deeper darkness of the Gulag. Yet on a day whose exact date the records obscure, as if time itself wanted to forget the precision of that moment, he was told to gather his few possessions. No explanation, no fanfare, simply, you are to be released. The gates of Butyrka opened onto a Moscow winter that looked much like any other to the naked eye, but which must have felt, to a man who had been locked away in a cell barely wider than his shoulders, like stepping into an infinite space. His body was different now. Years of meager rations, of standing through nights of interrogation, of the particular cold that lives in concrete walls had marked him. His teeth were damaged. His health was fragile. He was 43 years old, but moved like a man of 60. The question that might have crossed his mind, though perhaps he was wise enough not to voice it even to himself, was simple and utterly terrifying. Why? The answer lay in a shift that few outside the highest circles of Soviet leadership fully understood. The summer and autumn of 1940 had brought urgent messages to Stalin's desk, reports from military councils and strategic assessments that would eventually prove prophetic. Europe was burning. France had fallen to Hitler in June. Britain stood alone and defiant. The Wehrmacht's reach was extending eastward with a hunger that no sane observer could ignore. And the Soviet Union, for all its size and ideology, was not prepared for the storm that was gathering just beyond its western borders. Stalin, in his calculating way, had begun to realize that the officers he had imprisoned and destroyed might soon be desperately needed, not out of mercy, never out of mercy, but out of necessity. The purges had created a vacuum in the Red Army's command structure, an absence of experienced leadership that was beginning to look less like revolutionary cleansing and more like strategic suicide. Rehabilitation, in the Soviet system of that era, was a strange and tentative thing. One did not simply walk free from Butyrka and resume a normal life. Rokossovsky was, technically, still under suspicion. He had confessed under torture to things he had never done, accusations that remained on record, that lived in files, that could be resurrected at any moment. There was an understanding, unuttered but perfectly clear, that his freedom was conditional. He lived in a kind of shadow, neither prisoner nor fully restored, existing in a space where gratitude and dread mingled inseparably. The documentation from this period is sparse and carefully worded, which itself tells a story. What we know is that Rokossovsky was given modest work, first in minor positions, quietly re-entering the structure of military service without ceremony or acknowledgement of the injustice he had suffered. No one apologized. No compensation was offered. The regime did not work that way. A man released from the cellars was simply expected to be grateful for breath and to ask no questions about why he had been placed there in the first place. And Rokossovsky, if the accounts of those who knew him are to be believed, appears to have accepted this with a kind of stoic grace that suggests either profound wisdom or profound exhaustion, or perhaps both. But even as he was quietly being repositioned within the military apparatus, the world beyond Soviet borders was convulsing. In the spring of 1941, with each passing month bringing new intelligence of German military build-up along the western frontier, the need for capable commanders became not merely urgent, but existential. Hitler was preparing an invasion of the Soviet Union, an operation of such scale and ambition that it would reshape everything. And Stalin, despite warnings and evidence, was not fully convinced it was imminent. Yet he was aware enough to begin calling men like Rokossovsky back from the liminal space where they had been held in suspension. By the late spring of 1941, Rokossovsky had been given a genuine posting once more, a command, not the position of great prominence that his talents might have commanded, but a meaningful one nonetheless. He was assigned to the 20th Army, a unit stationed in the Western Military District, the very region where the terrible storm was about to break. There is something almost tragic in the timing, something that suggests the Soviet leadership was playing a kind of desperate gamble with the lives of its officers. They had destroyed so many of the best minds, imprisoned the most experienced commanders, and now, as darkness gathered, they needed those very men to stand in the breach. How did Rokossovsky feel, returning to command after 2 years in a cell, after having confessed to lies, after understanding with absolute clarity that his life had been held in contempt by the system he was called upon to serve? The historical record does not offer us his inner thoughts. He was a professional soldier, trained in an era when officers did not record complaints or express doubts about the regimes they served. What we can observe is that he stepped into his new role with what witnesses described as characteristic calmness. Not the calmness of indifference, but the calmness of a man who had looked directly into the abyss and had learned that fear, while real, need not determine action. The Soviet military, as spring turned towards summer in 1941, was a force in desperate transition. It possessed enormous numbers, but had lost much of its leadership. The purges had hollowed out the officer corps, leaving gaps that could not be quickly filled. Into those gaps, men like Rokossovsky stepped. And perhaps there is a kind of bitter justice, if we can call it that, in the notion that his very suffering in prison, his refusal to betray comrades even under torture, his capacity to endure injustice without breaking, had prepared him for what was coming. The war would demand everything a human being could give. The camps had already taken almost everything. What remained was perhaps just enough to serve. In early June, as the German armies massed along the border and as Nazi aircraft began their photographic reconnaissance of Soviet positions, Rokossovsky was in place. He did not know the exact timing of what was coming. Few did, but the quality of the spring air, the intensity of the preparations, the almost visible electrical charge in the atmosphere around military headquarters, all pointed toward one inexorable conclusion. War was not coming. War was arriving. The summer of 1941 arrived with a clarity that seemed to mock the world's turbulence. Across the western reaches of the Soviet Union, the fields were drying beneath a steady sun. Grain swayed in the heat. Forests opened their canopies to warm, still air. And somewhere in that pastoral quiet, unaware that the calendar held only days remaining, men were sleeping in their barracks, and women were tending gardens, and children played in villages whose names would soon become synonymous with absolute ruin. Rokossovsky, rehabilitated barely a year before, had found his way back to the cavalry, that old love of his youth, but not quite the cavalry as he had known it. The Red Army was evolving, necessarily, into something different from the romantic mounted charges of the Civil War era. Tanks were becoming the new horses. Coordination across vast distances was becoming the new skill. He was 44 years old, hardened by imprisonment in ways that a man without such experience could scarcely understand, and he moved through the Soviet military hierarchy with the careful deliberateness of someone who had learned never to presume that tomorrow would arrive as expected. In June, the Germans came, not with warning, not with diplomacy or ultimatum, though Hitler had been building toward this invasion for years, and Soviet intelligence had whispered hints of it. But the scale of it, the sheer geometric impossibility of so much machinery and flesh converging simultaneously across such an immense frontier, no amount of preparation could have truly readied the mind for this. On the 22nd of June 1941, German forces crossed the border in numbers that seemed to defy mathematics. 3 million men, thousands upon thousands of tanks and trucks and artillery pieces. The invasion, later called Operation Barbarossa, would become the deadliest military campaign in human history. That, however, was not yet known. What was known in those first hours was only the fact that everything had changed and that the Soviet Union was suddenly, unmistakably, at war. The western frontier of the Soviet Union in that moment was not a carefully defended line. It was a kind of assumption that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the non-aggression agreement signed 2 years earlier, had rendered such a frontier somehow negotiable, somehow less urgent. Troops were spread thinly. Fortifications were incomplete. The Red Army's command structure, still traumatized by the purges that had claimed so many of its best minds, was operating partly on recovered competence and partly on the adrenaline of sudden necessity. Communications between units were often poor. Supply lines were improvised. And advancing from the west in a carefully coordinated avalanche came the Wehrmacht, that formidable instrument of German military engineering, along with allied forces from Romania and Hungary and Italy and Finland, all of them converging on the Soviet Union from multiple directions with the clear intention of destroying it. Rokossovsky was assigned to a command position near Smolensk, a city that would become one of the pivotal battlegrounds of the war's early eastern phase. What he found when he arrived was not an organized defensive line, but rather a kind of organized chaos. Units were retreating. Orders were sometimes contradictory. The German strategy, which they called Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, depended on moving so quickly and striking with such concentrated force that the enemy's normal defensive responses became impossible. Slow your troops down, encircle them, destroy them piecemeal, keep moving, never allow consolidation. This had worked brilliantly in Poland and France. It had created a kind of psychological momentum that made victory seem inevitable, perhaps even foreordained. What no one had fully anticipated, or what the Germans had not adequately anticipated, was that the Soviet Union was simply too large, too deep, too rich with distance and space and the possibility of retreat. You could win battles here, win them decisively, and still find yourself thousands of kilometers from true victory, still facing fresh armies emerging from the vastness beyond. In these first catastrophic weeks, Rokossovsky demonstrated something that would become increasingly characteristic of his command style, a kind of calm that was not indifference, but something closer to a steady clarity of mind under conditions of extreme pressure. He was not a general who sought to impress through grand gestures or through the kind of ego-driven commands that characterized so many commanders of that era. Instead, he moved through his day with an almost methodical attention to detail. Where could forces be consolidated? Where could supply lines be shortened? How could damaged units be reformed? How could local commanders be supported rather than hectored? There is something to consider about the psychology of a man who has been tortured by his own government, who has had teeth broken and bones cracked in the name of loyalty, and who has been released back into service only when that government suddenly needed his skills. Such a man does not carry the illusions of those who have never faced absolute powerlessness. He understands viscerally that systems can fail, that certainty is temporary, and that survival depends on adaptation. Where others might have panicked or become paralyzed by the sheer scale of the disaster unfolding around them, Rokossovsky seemed to move with a kind of purposeful steadiness that suggested to those around him that the situation, however dire, was not beyond the reach of human comprehension and response. The German advance continued with terrible momentum. Smolensk fell after weeks of fierce fighting. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured or killed in the opening months. Moscow, the Soviet capital itself, seemed to be drawing into the German target like a moth toward inevitable flame. The great generals of the Red Army, particularly Georgy Zhukov, who would become perhaps the most capable Soviet commander of the war, recognized in Rokossovsky something useful. Here was a man who did not break under pressure. Here was a man who understood the coordination of armor and infantry and artillery in ways that seemed almost instinctive. And most importantly, here was a man who had survived the purges, which meant that he knew how to operate within the constraints of Soviet command while still maintaining some degree of independent judgment. As the campaigns deepened and the Soviet Union began, slowly and at terrible cost, to stabilize its defenses and organize more coherent responses to the German onslaught, Rokossovsky found himself being moved from position to position, always toward the areas of greatest crisis. It was exhausting work. It was also, in a strange sense, what he had been shaped for. The torture that had broken his teeth had not broken something essential in him. The imprisonment that had lasted for months had not destroyed his capacity for clear thought. And the years before the revolution, the years of cavalry training and the slow development of military understanding, all of that had accumulated into a readiness that perhaps no other form of preparation could have created. What followed were months of improvisation and desperate defensive action, of understanding that the Germans, despite their seemingly overwhelming advantage, could still be slowed, still be stopped, still be made to pay a terrible price for every kilometer of advance. Rokossovsky became one of the architects of this slowing, this stopping, this painful resistance, and in doing so, he began to become something more than simply a rehabilitated commander trying to prove his worthiness. He was becoming, almost without anyone quite noticing it yet, one of the indispensable men of the Soviet Union's survival. In the autumn of 1941, as the first snows began to fall across the western approaches to Moscow, Konstantin Rokossovsky found himself standing in a command post buried deep within the frozen earth, studying maps by the amber glow of oil lamps, his mind turning over the mathematics of survival. The German armies under Army Group Center were driving eastward with a force and momentum that seemed almost unstoppable, and yet something had shifted in the rhythm of the war. The long summer offensives had lost their final lethal speed. The Wehrmacht was slowing, and in that slowing, Rokossovsky and the men around him, particularly the formidable Georgy Zhukov, who had come to direct the Soviet defense, began to see not inevitability, but possibility. It is a peculiar thing to command troops when your own nation has tried to destroy you, when your own government has imprisoned you and tortured you and demanded your confession to crimes you did not commit. Most men would carry a wound so deep that it would color every decision, every judgment, every moment of trust. And yet Rokossovsky seems to have possessed something rarer than forgiveness. He possessed compartmentalization born from long suffering. He had learned, in the cells of the Lubyanka, that rage and bitterness were luxuries, clarity of mind was survival. And so in those winter months, as the fate of Moscow hung in the balance, he brought to his duties not the fevered determination of a man with something to prove, but the steady, almost meditative focus of someone who had already endured the worst his own side could inflict. Under Zhukov's overall coordination, Rokossovsky was given command of the 16th Army on the Moscow front, and what observers and historians have noted about his tenure there is something almost countercultural for the Soviet system of the time. While other commanders were pushing their divisions to exhaustion, driving men forward in desperate, often futile assaults against German defensive positions, Rokossovsky seemed to move with a different tempo. He calculated, he waited. He observed where the German lines were thin, where exhaustion was beginning to show in enemy movements, where a carefully timed, well-concentrated blow might yield results without the kind of catastrophic casualties that had defined earlier Soviet offensives. This approach was not passivity. It was the opposite. It was the product of a mind that had studied cavalry warfare in the old Tsarist army, had watched the way mounted formations could devastate an enemy when deployed with precision at the moment of maximum vulnerability, and had translated that knowledge into the language of modern mechanized warfare. One can imagine him, in those flickering lamplight command posts, running through scenarios in his mind. The position of German reserves, the state of their supplies, the psychological condition of their troops after months of grinding combat against an enemy that simply would not die. He was playing several moves ahead, like a player of chess who has learned to see the board not as it is, but as it will be. What made Rokossovsky different from many of his contemporaries, though, was something more fundamental than tactical cleverness. There are accounts from officers and soldiers who served under him during this period that speak to a quality unusual in Red Army commanders of the time, a kind of attentiveness to the human cost of his orders. He did not squander his men. When his units were ordered to hold positions, he ensured they had what supplies could be gathered. When they were ordered to advance, he gave them clear objectives and realistic assessments of what they faced. In an army where commanders often treated enlisted men as expendable resources to be consumed in the service of strategic ambitions, Rokossovsky moved with a different presumption, that soldiers were human beings, and that their lives mattered, and that a commander's first duty was to preserve them when possible and only to spend them when truly necessary. This is not to suggest he was soft or reluctant or anything other than completely committed to victory, but there is a difference, perhaps, between a commander who pursues victory at any cost and one who pursues victory while remaining conscious of the cost. Rokossovsky seems to have belonged to the latter category. The Battle of Moscow itself unfolded across those bitter winter months of late 1941 and early 1942. The Germans launched their assault on the Soviet capital with the full force of Army Group Center, driving toward the city's outer defenses with the aim of capturing it before winter locked them in place. The assault came very close to succeeding. At certain points, German spearheads penetrated to within sight of Moscow's outer suburbs. The city braced for siege or occupation. Stalin, we are told, considered evacuating the government. The psychological pressure was immense, and yet the Soviet defenses held. Not everywhere, and not without terrible cost, but they held. Rokossovsky's 16th Army, positioned on the northwestern approaches, became one of the pillars of that defense. What made the difference, according to accounts that have survived, was not primarily firepower or numbers. In fact, the Soviets were often outnumbered in men and equipment. What made the difference was the way Rokossovsky coordinated his defense. He established layered defensive positions rather than trying to hold a single, unbroken line that could be broken at a point and exploited. He maintained reserves that could be brought forward to reinforce threatened sectors. He established clear chains of command that allowed for rapid decision-making without the paralysis that could come from waiting for orders from higher up the hierarchy. Most significantly, he seemed to understand something crucial about defensive warfare in the modern era, that successful defense is not about holding every meter of ground, but about imposing costs on the attacker that exceed what the attacker can sustain. By holding in some places, yielding ground in others, and concentrating his forces at moments and locations where they could inflict maximum damage, Rokossovsky gradually ground down the German momentum. The assault, which had begun with such promise for the Germans, began to slow, to falter, and eventually to stop. By early 1942, the Germans had been pushed back from Moscow's immediate surroundings. It was not a decisive Soviet victory. Far from it. The Germans would remain a powerful force on the Soviet frontier for months and years to come. But it was a moment of psychological turning point. The Wehrmacht had been stopped. The myth of German invincibility had been cracked, and in the mind of Stalin, and perhaps more importantly in the mind of Zhukov, Rokossovsky's reputation as a commander had been substantially elevated. There is something almost poignant about observing Rokossovsky in this period. Here was a man who, less than a year before, had been released from Soviet imprisonment, with his teeth knocked out, his hands broken from torture, his body weakened by starvation and beatings. Here he was, a year later, conducting one of the most important defensive operations of the war, earning the trust of his superiors, demonstrating competence and composure under conditions of extreme stress. One wonders what passed through his mind during those quiet moments in command posts, when the work of planning and directing was temporarily complete, and he could allow himself a few moments of reflection. Did he think of the cells where he had spent so many months? Did he wonder how different things might have been if his interrogators had succeeded in breaking him, if he had confessed to the false accusations they had hurled at him, if he had betrayed comrades in order to save himself? The historical record gives us no window into his private thoughts, but the record does show us a man who, despite everything that had been done to him, remained capable of clarity, of strategic thinking, of genuine concern for the welfare of the soldiers under his command. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson of Rokossovsky's character in this period. Injustice had been visited upon him. Torture had been inflicted upon him. His nation, his own government, had attempted to destroy him, and yet he had emerged from that darkness, not bitter, not vengeful, not consumed by the need to prove something to those who had wronged him. Instead, he had emerged with something almost like equanimity, the ability to see the present moment clearly, to make decisions based on reason rather than emotion, to care for others even while holding a clear understanding of the stakes involved. As the war deepened and the scope of his responsibilities grew larger, this quality would become increasingly important. For now, though, in the winter darkness of the Moscow front, it manifested as something deceptively simple, a steady hand on the tiller, a clear mind thinking several moves ahead, and a quiet conviction that soldiers deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, even in the depths of total war. What emerged from the camps was not a broken man, but something perhaps more rare and difficult to hold, a commander who had learned that soldiers were not mere instruments to be spent like ammunition, but human beings whose fear and exhaustion shaped everything they could accomplish. In an era when Soviet officers were trained to see the men beneath them as expendable resources, when the doctrine of the time demanded speed at any cost, and bodies were treated as the cheapest commodity of war, Rokossovsky seemed to operate from an entirely different moral calculus. Some who served under him would later speak of this quality with a kind of quiet wonder, as though they had glimpsed something counterintuitive in the Soviet command structure. A general who actually believed that soldiers fought better when they were not driven to despair. The contradiction cannot be overstated. The Soviet military culture of the 1930s and 1940s was built on a particular kind of cruelty. Officers were expected to enforce discipline through fear. Deserters were shot in front of their regiments. Soldiers were often sent into hopeless attacks to achieve political or strategic objectives, their lives weighed as nothing against the ambitions of distant planners in Moscow. And yet Rokossovsky, having endured torture himself, having been forced to sign confessions to crimes he did not commit, having spent months in darkness wondering if the next day would bring his execution, seemed incapable of replicating that machinery of terror when it came to his own men. Consider the small, revealing details that accumulated in the testimonies of those who knew him. He was known to walk through military hospitals and actually speak with wounded soldiers, not as a ritual gesture of leadership, but as a man genuinely interested in their conditions and their thoughts. He was noted for his insistence that supply lines be organized properly, that men receive adequate food and rest before major operations, that artillery support be coordinated carefully rather than simply ordered, without regard for how it would be executed. These were not revolutionary ideas in any abstract sense. They were the basic practices of a competent administrator, and yet in the context of Soviet command, they marked him as something almost unusual, a man who thought of logistics and morale as inseparable from victory itself. This may seem like a natural instinct to a modern ear, but it is worth pausing to recognize how divergent it was from the prevailing approach. The Soviet command structure, especially after the losses of 1941 and 1942, had developed a kind of ruthless pragmatism. If an objective needed to be taken, it would be taken, regardless of how many soldiers fell in the attempt. If an offensive needed to begin on a particular date for political reasons, it would begin, whether the troops were ready or not. The weight of orders from above was immense, and most commanders learned to accept this weight and pass it downward without modification. Rokossovsky, by contrast, seemed to have developed an almost stubborn habit of pushing back, of asking for clarification, of insisting that orders be feasible given the actual state of his forces. Zhukov, who worked closely with him throughout the later war years and held him in evident respect, would note that Rokossovsky had a gift for understanding what his men could actually accomplish. This was not sentiment, it was calculation. A soldier who knew he was going to be properly fed, who believed his officer had thought through the operation, who understood that his life was not being thrown away for nothing, would fight harder and more effectively than one driven only by terror. It was a kind of empirical wisdom, learned perhaps in the most brutal classroom imaginable, the interrogation cell and the prison camp. There is something almost delicate about the way this played out in his command philosophy. He maintained discipline. Soviet armies were not soft, and soldiers knew there were consequences for failure, but the discipline seemed to come from a place of mutual understanding, rather than pure coercion. Officers serving under Rokossovsky reported that he demanded competence and clarity of thinking. He could be sharp with subordinates who failed to plan adequately or who did not understand their orders, but he did not cultivate an atmosphere of arbitrary terror, of unpredictable punishment, of the kind of paranoia that infected so much of the Soviet officer corps. One might wonder, having survived the prison, why he did not adopt an even harder shell, why he did not become one of those commanders who used brutality as armor, as a way of establishing control and distance. Some men who emerge from totalitarian torture do precisely that. They become the enforcers, channeling their trauma into dominance over others. Yet Rokossovsky seemed to have traveled a different psychological path. Perhaps the very fact of his torture, of knowing in his bones what it felt like to be treated as disposable, made him incapable of doing the same to others. Or perhaps he had simply learned, through months of reflection in captivity, that leadership built on fear alone was fragile and exhausting. There is a paradox here worth sitting with. A man who had been victimized by the Soviet system's worst impulses became one of its most ethically thoughtful practitioners. His approach to the cavalry arm was particularly revealing. The cavalry tradition in Soviet culture carried with it both romance and a kind of violent enthusiasm. Horses were seen as noble, and cavalry officers often saw themselves as inheritors of a tradition of bold, sweeping operations. Yet Rokossovsky, despite his own roots in cavalry and his clear love for the beauty and discipline of horsemanship, seemed to view cavalry as a practical tool to be employed with calculation rather than passion. He would not waste mounted units on futile charges. He understood, with an almost modern sensibility, that cavalry in the age of machine guns and artillery was valuable precisely for mobility and reconnaissance, not for the kind of romantic charges that had defined 19th century warfare. This distinction between the mythology of his military culture and his actual practice suggests something about how Rokossovsky inhabited his role. He was not simply absorbing the Soviet doctrine and passing it downward unchanged. He was thinking independently, quietly, about what actually worked and what did not. This kind of thinking was itself dangerous in the Soviet context. It required the courage to question, at least internally, and the discipline to question only what was truly necessary while appearing to conform outwardly. He had learned this art, perhaps, in the prison, where survival depended on an exquisite balance between appearing to comply and secretly maintaining one's integrity. By the time Rokossovsky had returned to full command in 1940 and then moved into the larger operations of the war, this philosophy had become almost a second nature. It influenced his operational planning at Moscow, where he worked with Zhukov to organize a defense that, while violent and costly, preserved Soviet forces and allowed them to recover. It would influence Stalingrad, where his part in the encirclement involved not just tactical brilliance, but also an understanding of how reserves needed to be positioned and when men needed rest. It would define his approach at Kursk, where the largest tank battle in history was won partly through superior planning, but also through an almost patient discipline in how that plan was executed. The contrast with the general Soviet command culture of the time is worth dwelling on, because it helps explain both his rise and, later, his relative falls. He was trusted by Zhukov and by the men who served under him because he delivered results without creating the kind of chaos that indiscriminate brutality often produced. Yet he was also, in some quarters, viewed with a kind of suspicion, gentleness with soldiers, a kind of intellectual independence, an unwillingness to simply echo whatever doctrine Moscow had most recently proclaimed. These qualities could be misinterpreted, especially in a system built on paranoia and control. How many of his peers viewed his restraint as weakness, or worse, as a form of hidden disloyalty? It is impossible to know, but the wariness seems to have always followed him, even in his moments of greatest success. What Rokossovsky had become, through suffering and reflection, was a kind of counter-example to the prevailing command culture of his time. He proved, by his results and by the testimony of those who served him, that a different way of leading was possible, even within the Soviet system. Not rebellion, not open challenge, but a quiet, persistent practice of treating soldiers as thinking beings rather than simply as mechanisms of destruction. And perhaps that is why he endures in memory with a particular kind of respect, not just as a brilliant strategist, but as a man who managed, against the grain of his era, to retain his humanity and to extend that humanity in small but meaningful ways to those under his command. The winter of 1942 descended on southern Russia like a slowly closing fist, and in the city of Stalingrad, along the frozen banks of the Volga River, something was shifting in the grand and terrible machinery of the Eastern Front. For months, the German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus had held the city in a grinding, block-by-block struggle, and the Wehrmacht command in Berlin believed they had cornered the Soviets in their own ruins. But what no one on the German side yet understood was that Soviet generals, led by the calculating mind of Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov and executed with precise, patient brilliance by Konstantin Rokossovsky, were weaving a far larger net. It is one of those moments in history where the turning point arrives almost imperceptibly, in the silence before the trap closes, and we find ourselves suspended between what was and what would be. Rokossovsky had been positioned, in these final months of autumn, as the commander of the Don Front, a vast theatre of operations centered on the great bend of the Don River to the northwest of Stalingrad. His task was not to take the city. That bitter honor belonged to General Alexander Vasilevsky's Stalingrad front, to the south, where soldiers fought through rubble and snow. Rokossovsky's assignment was something far more delicate, far more strategically elegant. He was to hold the line along the Don, and more crucially, he was to prepare for something that had been taking shape in the Soviet High Command's imagination for weeks, an enormous pincer movement, a sweeping encirclement that would cut off not merely a garrison, but an entire army. The operation had a name, though it would take weeks before the world learned it. It was called Operation Uranus. In the weeks preceding the offensive, as November approached, Rokossovsky moved with a deliberation that those around him had come to recognize as his signature. Where other commanders might have grown anxious, impatient, he seemed instead to deepen into a kind of meditative focus. He studied maps obsessively, walking the lines with his staff, observing the placement of reserves, checking and rechecking the disposition of artillery. He had learned, during his years of imprisonment, during those unbearable interrogations where every word had been measured for its potential to destroy him, a lesson that had crystallized into his command philosophy: patience could be a weapon, haste was the child of fear, and fear led to mistakes that cost men their lives. What Rokossovsky perceived, with the clarity that only a mind like his possessed, was that the German Sixth Army under Paulus was overextended along a vast front, holding Stalingrad while its flanks grew ever thinner. To the northwest of the city, holding the Don line, were Hungarian and Romanian forces, brave soldiers, many of them, but lacking the equipment, the reserves, and perhaps most critically, the willingness to die for German territorial ambitions. They were tired, they were far from home, and Rokossovsky, with an almost hunter's instinct, had understood where weakness lived. He had also understood something else. German commanders, bred in a tradition of lightning warfare and encirclement, often did not expect the very tactic to be used against them. By early November, Rokossovsky had concentrated nearly 1 million men, thousands of pieces of artillery, and hundreds of tanks along a front that faced these Romanian and Hungarian positions. The build-up had been carried out with remarkable stealth, an achievement that speaks to the kind of discipline and compartmentalization his command could enforce. The soldiers were moved at night. Supply lines were hidden. Artillery was carefully concealed. There was no alerting movement, no unnecessary chatter on open radio frequencies. The Germans, observing from their positions, assumed these were merely replacement forces, routine rotations of troops. Paulus's high command, it seemed, did not quite believe that the Soviets could concentrate such enormous force without their knowing it. Or perhaps they simply could not imagine that the enemy possessed both the means and the will to attempt something so vast and so risky. The attack, when it came on November 19th, arrived like thunder breaking over a frozen landscape. From positions to the north, Rokossovsky's Don front surged forward with a ferocity that was almost symphonic in its coordination. Waves of infantry, supported by armor and a curtain of artillery so dense that it seemed to reshape the very earth, poured across the Don and crashed into the Romanian positions. The Romanians, caught in a moment of relative complacency with insufficient reserves and inadequate air support, began to collapse. By the second day, the German command was receiving reports of massive Soviet breakthroughs. By the third day, it was clear that something catastrophic was unfolding. The very structure of the German defense was cracking open. What made this encirclement distinct from other similar operations? And here we must pause for a moment and observe the strange nature of military history, was not merely its scale, though it was certainly vast. It was that it was being executed with a methodical, almost deliberate slowness that served a precise purpose. Rokossovsky was not attempting a rapid collapse of the entire front. Instead, he was orchestrating a movement that closed the circle methodically, step by step, cutting off retreat routes, strangling supply lines, ensuring that the German Sixth Army, which remained locked in combat in Stalingrad, would find itself increasingly isolated. This was not the romance of cavalry charges or dramatic breakthroughs. This was the cold arithmetic of logistics and geography. The southern prong of the encirclement, coordinated by General Alexander Eremenko's Stalingrad front, lunged northward from positions south of Stalingrad, sweeping across the steppes with terrifying momentum. And on November 23rd, these two converging armies, Rokossovsky's from the north and west, Eremenko's from the south, met near the town of Kalach, and the great circle closed. Trapped within were not merely the German Sixth Army, but portions of the 4th Panzer Army as well. By conservative estimates, there were 300,000 soldiers encircled, cut off from supplies, from reinforcement, and from retreat. When Paulus received word of the encirclement, his response was one of cold professionalism mixed with growing horror. He requested permission from his superior, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, to attempt a breakout, to use his armor to cut through the Soviet lines and rejoin the broader German forces to the west. Manstein, from his headquarters, urged caution. He believed that a breakout could succeed if timed correctly and executed swiftly. But he also believed something else. If the Sixth Army could hold its ground within the encirclement, if it could maintain a perimeter and continue to resist, then the Wehrmacht could mount a relief operation. Fresh German forces would be gathered, a counter-offensive would be launched, and the Sixth Army would be rescued. It was a gamble, but in the desperate mathematics of warfare, it did not seem an impossible one. This was where Rokossovsky's understanding of the situation crystallized into action. He understood, perhaps better than anyone on the Soviet side at that moment, that he now held in his hands not merely a military victory, but the potential for something far larger, the destruction of an entire field army. And to achieve that, he needed to ensure that the encircled forces could not break out and that relief operations could not penetrate the ring. So he did two things. First, he consolidated the Soviet defensive positions, creating a perimeter around the trapped German forces that grew stronger with each passing day. Second, he coordinated with the Soviet High Command to position additional reserves in such a way that any German relief attempt would meet overwhelming force. What happened in the weeks that followed is often described in terms of military statistics: the daily shrinking of the perimeter, the gradual reduction in German supplies, the escalating privation within the encircled pocket. But there was something else occurring as well, something more psychological, more existential. Inside the encirclement, soldiers who had believed themselves to be members of an invincible army began to understand that they were trapped, that the promises of relief were growing fainter, that winter was closing in, and that the end, whatever form it took, was approaching. Messages began to arrive from the German High Command, assuring Paulus that rescue was coming, that he must hold on. Each day that passed made those messages seem more like fantasy and less like military probability. Rokossovsky, from his headquarters, monitored the situation with the calm of a man who understands that the military machine he has set in motion is functioning according to design. He was not gloating, according to those who served near him, nor was he expressing contempt for the enemy. Instead, there was in his bearing and his communications a kind of regretful inevitability, as if he were watching the unfolding of something that was both terrible and necessary, both tragic and inescapable. This was how he had learned to view war, perhaps, during those years of imprisonment, when he had watched men broken by interrogation and by despair. War was a mechanism that turned human beings into numbers, and all that a commander could do was to ensure that the mechanism functioned with as much precision and as little waste as possible. By late November, the German High Command had launched Operation Winter Storm, an attempt to break through the Soviet lines and relieve the encircled Sixth Army. Manstein, commanding this relief effort, assembled what forces he could and drove northward from the Caucasus. The battle that ensued was fierce and desperate, but it revealed a fundamental truth that Rokossovsky had already grasped. The Soviets now possessed sufficient reserves and sufficient defensive depth that they could contain both the encircled force and the relief attempt simultaneously. The German relief operation stalled short of its objective, and it became increasingly clear that Paulus's army was truly isolated. As December deepened, as the Soviet lines grew tighter and supplies within the encirclement grew more scarce, a kind of slow collapse began. The German soldiers, far from home, lacking adequate food and clothing for the brutal Russian winter, began to surrender in increasing numbers. Paulus himself, after weeks of hope and then weeks of grim determination, found himself confronting an impossible choice. He could continue to fight, knowing that it was futile, and watch his men starve and freeze to death. Or he could surrender, which would mean violating Hitler's direct orders to hold to the last man. Paulus, it should be said, was not a man of extraordinary personal courage, nor was he a brilliant tactician. He was a competent professional soldier, and he understood the terrible mathematics of his situation. On January 31st, 1943, Paulus made his Cassis. By the spring of 1943, the war had entered a season of calculation. The snow that had saved Russia was finally retreating northward, and with it came a quiet certainty that both sides understood. The summer would bring the largest tank battle in human history. The Germans, for their part, had planned an operation they called Unternehmen Citadel, Operation Citadel, a massive pincer movement designed to crush a Soviet bulge in the front lines near the city of Kursk. They had spent months preparing, accumulating new tanks, new assault guns, new weapons they believed would turn the tide. But there was something the Germans did not fully understand. The Soviets knew they were coming. Through the careful work of intelligence, through spies embedded in German headquarters, through the patient decryption of enemy communications, Rokossovsky and his commander Zhukov had learned of the operation months in advance. And in learning of it, they had made a decision that would reveal the depth of Rokossovsky's mind as a military strategist. Rather than meet the Germans in open maneuver, they would draw them into prepared ground. They would build defenses so deep, so layered, so methodically constructed that the Germans would exhaust themselves trying to break through. They would build fortifications that seemed to stretch backward for hundreds of kilometers, layer upon layer of trenches, anti-tank positions, minefields that contained millions of mines, reserves held in the shadows, always ready to strike. Rokossovsky was given command of the northern sector of this defensive line, and as the spring turned warmer, as the mud of the thaw hardened into earth, he moved through his assigned territory with a different kind of purpose than the hurried movements of earlier years. He was not desperate now. He was thinking. He would walk the lines, studying the terrain, speaking quietly with the engineers who were laying mines, with the officers who were positioning guns. There was a thoroughness to him that his men had come to recognize. He did not demand heroism through rhetoric. He demanded precision. He demanded that each gun be sighted correctly, that each trench have adequate shelter, that each reserve unit know exactly where it would stand when the moment came. A soldier under his command later recalled that Rokossovsky would appear without fanfare, observe their work, offer a suggestion, and disappear. Not a word of praise, but never a harsh word either. Just the quiet message that he had noticed them, that what they did mattered, that it would be done correctly or not at all. By early July, as the summer heat pressed down on the endless steppes, the German offensive finally began. Wave after wave of tanks rolled forward, Panthers and Tigers, the newest German armor, supported by infantry, by artillery, by the full machinery of German warfare. And they crashed against the Soviet defenses like water against stone. For days, the battle raged. The Germans pushed forward in the north, under the command of Model, one of their finest tacticians. They advanced several kilometers. They broke through the first defensive line, then the second. But with each kilometer forward, they were moving more slowly. With each day, their casualties mounted. With each hour, Soviet reserves appeared as if from nowhere, reinforcing the line, positioning counterattacks. Rokossovsky was not reacting to the battle moment by moment. He was executing a plan. The Germans were pressing forward into a landscape he had prepared, into positions he had foreseen. And when they had exhausted themselves enough, when their momentum had slowed to something manageable, he would release the reserves. Not in a desperate gamble, but as part of a calculation that had been worked out weeks before. This was leadership of a different order than what had come before. This was not the cavalry dash, not the desperate improvisation, not the young officer learning under fire. This was a mature commander, one who had survived imprisonment and torture and emerged not broken but refined, whose understanding of warfare had been hammered into him by suffering. The Battle of Kursk lasted 2 weeks. In the south, Soviet forces eventually pushed the Germans back. In the north, where Rokossovsky commanded, the situation was more delicate, more subtle. The Germans advanced, but not decisively. They began to encounter signs of Soviet strength ahead, of forces gathering, of the possibility that they might be drawn into something worse than attrition. And then, before the decisive moment could be reached, Hitler cancelled the entire operation. There were complications elsewhere on the front. There were political pressures. The grand assault on Kursk, the operation the Germans had prepared so carefully, simply stopped. The Soviets had not won this battle in the traditional sense of a dramatic breakthrough, a surrounded enemy, a triumphant advance. They had won it by refusing to be broken. They had won it by refusing to be broken, they understanding their enemy's intentions and preparing ground accordingly. They had won it by the patient, methodical construction of defensive depth. And in that victory, something crucial had become visible to Stalin, to Zhukov, to the Soviet High Command. Rokossovsky was not simply a talented commander. He was a strategic mind of the First Order. The remainder of the summer would bring successive Soviet offensives. The Red Army was moving now, not in retreat or static defense, but in the calculated, rolling advances of an army that had learned how to wage war at scale. Rokossovsky participated in these offensives, but he also understood something that was becoming clearer with each passing month. The war was changing. The initiative was no longer in German hands. It had shifted, fundamentally, toward the Soviet Union. The question was no longer whether the Soviets would survive, but where the war would end, and what shape the map of Europe would take when the guns finally fell silent. There was a quality to his operations now that spoke to something deeper than mere competence. He seemed to understand that the tool of an army was not just violence, but the precise application of force at the right moment and in the right place. Other Soviet commanders would sometimes rely on overwhelming numbers, on the brutal logic of having more men to sacrifice than the enemy. Rokossovsky preferred economy of effort. He would study the enemy position, understand its weakness, strike there with sufficient force to break it, then move reserves through the gap created. His men had learned to trust this logic. They would hear their marshal was taking command of a sector, and they would know that the operation had been thought through, that their sacrifice would be made for a reason, not merely to be squandered in the stupidity of human attrition. By the end of that summer of 1943, the trajectory of his career had shifted fundamentally. He was no longer simply a commander who had survived. He was becoming one of the Soviet Union's most essential strategic assets. The trauma of imprisonment had somehow been transformed into clarity. The man who had faced torture had emerged with a vision of warfare that transcended the cruelty around him, that maintained a kind of human dignity even in the midst of industrial killing. Whether that dignity was real or an illusion born from distance and time, history does not easily tell us. But to those who served under him, it was as real as the ground beneath their feet, as real as the careful placement of a gun, as real as the knowledge that when their marshal had made a decision, they could trust it to be grounded in thought, not in whim or in fear. By the summer of 1944, the Soviet Union had transformed itself from the desperate, reeling nation that nearly collapsed beneath the German invasion into something altogether different. The old fears remained, of course, and the old losses never truly fade. But across the vast expanse between Moscow and the western frontier, a profound shift had taken place in the minds of Soviet commanders. They had learned, they had survived. And now, in the gathering warmth of that particular June, they were preparing to unleash something the Wehrmacht had never quite encountered before, a coordinated offensive of such scale and precision that it would reshape the very map of Eastern Europe. Rokossovsky stood at the center of this unfolding vision, though few in the West yet knew his name. To them, he remained a shadow, a name in dispatches. But within the Soviet command structure, he had become something far more substantial. He was Zhukov's partner now, not merely his subordinate. He was trusted with the kind of responsibilities that demanded not just military cunning, but an almost surgical understanding of logistics, timing, and the psychology of men exhausted by years of warfare. The operation that would come to be called Bagration was, in its very conception, a masterwork of long-range planning. It would strike not at a single point, as the Germans might have expected, but across a front so vast that the enemy could not possibly hope to defend it all. 3 Soviet army groups would advance simultaneously. 2 million men, 3,000 tanks, overwhelming artillery. And yet, for all that raw power, what gave it its shape and its soul was something far more delicate: the careful orchestration of movement, the precise timing of thrusts and retreats, the calculated use of terrain and deception. Where did Rokossovsky fit within this vast machinery? He commanded the First Belarusian Front, that great sweeping arc of Soviet forces stretched across the countryside like a drawn bow. The plan, as it had been sketched for him, was to smash through the German lines, holding what the Soviets called Belorussia, the land of White Russia, that tragic and contested territory that had suffered so terribly beneath occupation. For 3 long years, the Wehrmacht had held this ground. 3 years of plunder and suffering, of forests torn open by artillery, of villages erased not by accident, but by design. The German commanders there believed themselves reasonably secure behind lines that had, after all, held since 1942. They believed the Soviet winter offensive had exhausted itself. They believed that the true German strength still lay to the south, and that any Soviet thrust would come there, toward Ukraine and the western steppes. But Rokossovsky understood what the Germans did not, that their intelligence had been compromised, that their reserves were thin, that the very solidity of their lines concealed a kind of brittleness. He did not rush. He did not succumb to the impatience that so often overtook military minds in the shadow of great opportunity. Instead, he moved with the kind of deliberation that some might mistake for hesitation. He inspected his logistics. He ensured that his supply lines could genuinely sustain the offensive that was coming. He met with his army commanders, not to inspire them with rhetoric, but to ensure that they understood, in precise and measurable terms, what would be asked of them. He spoke often of the importance of care, of attention to detail, of the way that armies move forward not through valor alone, but through the unglamorous work of feeding men and maintaining vehicles and ensuring that ammunition arrives where it is promised. When the offensive began, on the 23rd of June 1944, it moved with a kind of terrible inevitability. The German lines, which had seemed so permanent, began to crack almost immediately. Rokossovsky's forces advanced not in a narrow wedge, as the Germans feared, but across a broad and deepening front. By the end of the first week, the Wehrmacht's vaunted army group center had been shattered into fragments. Towns fell, cities fell. The pace of advance quickened day by day, and yet Rokossovsky remained cautious, always aware that advancing too swiftly could expose his flanks, could stretch his supply lines to the breaking point, could invite the kind of counterattack that might pause or reverse his momentum. But something else was happening as well, something that no strategic overview could quite capture. As the Soviet forces advanced westward, they were entering territory that was, in the deepest sense, returning to the known world. The occupation was ending. The oppression was lifting. Villages that had been held in a kind of frozen horror for 3 years suddenly felt the presence of liberation, however complicated and ambiguous that word might prove to be. And Rokossovsky, who had been torn from his own homeland as a boy, who carried within himself the complicated inheritance of Polish blood and Russian service, was moving closer with each day toward the country of his birth. Did he feel it? Did he sense the weight of that approaching threshold? The way that the maps being marked with Soviet advances were also maps of a return. By early July, his forces had liberated Minsk, the capital of Belarusia. The speed of this advance was almost disorienting. In less than 3 weeks, Rokossovsky had driven the Wehrmacht back nearly 300 kilometers. The destruction was immense, the cost in German lives staggering, but the cost to the Soviet forces themselves was also substantial. The exhaustion that accompanies rapid advance, the way that supply lines strain and snap, the accumulation of losses that blur together into a kind of terrible monotony, all of these weighed upon him. And yet the momentum was undeniable, the opportunity glittering before him. By midsummer, as the forests of Belarus began to give way to the different landscape of the lands beyond, the Soviet advance had brought Rokossovsky's forces to the borders of his own childhood. Poland lay ahead. The Vistula River, that great waterway that had shaped the geography of his dreams and his memories, was now within reach of his armies. Is it possible that a commander can maintain the clarity of mind necessary for grand strategy while carrying within him the weight of personal destiny? Perhaps that is something we cannot truly know, something that remains locked within the private geography of a single human consciousness. What we can say is that Rokossovsky continued to advance, continued to execute his orders with the same meticulous care that had characterized every phase of his military career. The Germans were collapsing. The war in the East, though it would continue for months more, had fundamentally turned, and a man who had been torn from his homeland, imprisoned, broken, and somehow restored, was moving toward a reckoning with everything he had lost. The brilliance of Operation Bagration, as history would come to recognize it, lay not merely in its scale or its success, but in the way it had been constructed as an instrument of Rokossovsky's particular genius. He had the power to destroy, yes, and the German army group that faced him was indeed destroyed. But he also had the power to open, to liberate, to bring change across a vast territory. The weight of that power, the burden of it, was something he carried with a kind of quiet acceptance. The advance continued, the maps changed, and somewhere ahead, across the Vistula and into the lands of his memory, Poland waited. It was August 1944, and the city of Warsaw had begun to stir with a different kind of desperation. In the streets and cellars, in the underground presses and the whispered meetings of the Home Army, a decision was taking shape that would soon tear at the conscience of one man in particular. Rokossovsky, by then a marshal of the Soviet Union, sat in his command headquarters 200 kilometers to the east, watching the reports come in from his intelligence officers. The uprising was coming. He knew it. Everyone along the front knew it. And what came next was perhaps the most conflicted moment of his entire life. For weeks, the Polish underground had been preparing. The Soviet army was advancing. The Germans seemed finally, at last, to be retreating. To the Poles, this was the moment. This was when they could rise, reclaim their capital, assert their independence before the Russians arrived to impose their own order. Radio signals crackled across the city. Newspapers, clandestine, dangerous newspapers, urged the people forward. On the 1st of August, as the summer heat pressed down on the rubble and the ruins, the uprising began. Consider for a moment the impossible position in which this Polish-born marshal now found himself. He had suffered torture in Soviet prisons. He had been degraded, nearly destroyed by the very state he now served. And yet he had chosen, or had been forced to choose, to remain loyal, to remain Soviet, to become one of Stalin's most capable instruments. Now, his homeland was rising, his people were calling out, and he was on the other side of the advancing line, serving interests that were not Polish interests at all. The Warsaw Uprising was a beautiful, tragic eruption of hope. For 63 days, ordinary people, students, teachers, workers, shopkeepers, teenagers with homemade weapons, fought against the German occupation with a courage that seemed almost to defy the mathematics of power. They had been crushed before. Their nation had been partitioned and erased and invaded and buried so many times. But this time, they thought, with the Red Army approaching, with the thunder of artillery drawing nearer each day, surely this time they could reclaim their own city. Rokossovsky received the first reports with what sources describe as profound, almost suffocating unease. His staff noticed it. The careful, methodical marshal seemed caught between two states of being. And then came the order, or rather, came the non-order. The military decision, which was of course also a political decision, which was of course ultimately Stalin's decision, was made. The Soviet advance would slow. The Red Army would consolidate positions on the eastern bank of the Vistula River. There would be no immediate assault into the city. There would be no relief column sent to support the insurgents. The time was not right, the reports would later claim. Supply lines were overstretched. The troops needed to regroup. But everyone who was there, everyone who lived through those weeks, understood what was truly happening. Stalin wanted Warsaw to burn itself out first. The German garrison would do the killing. The Polish Home Army, the military wing of the Polish government in exile, the army that represented an independent Poland, would be destroyed in the fighting. By the time the Soviets entered the city, and they would enter it, inevitably, victoriously, there would be no organized resistance, no shadow government, no independent military force to complicate the Soviet occupation that was to come. It was, in its way, a masterpiece of political calculation, and it was also, in its way, an apocalypse. The historical record on Rokossovsky's exact role in this decision remains somewhat unclear, which is perhaps fitting. We know that he was present at the command level. We know that he maintained communication with the Stavka, the Soviet High Command, and therefore with Stalin himself. We know that his armies stood ready, that his forces were capable of supporting the uprising, and that this support did not come. What we do not know with perfect certainty is whether Rokossovsky argued for intervention, whether he pushed back against the order to wait, whether he understood, in the depths of his being, the full moral weight of what was being done. Some historians have suggested, carefully and with appropriate qualification, that Rokossovsky may have at least made the case for action, that a man who had been so brutalized by the Soviet system, who had seen the worst of what totalitarian power could do, might have harbored some instinct toward mercy, toward helping his own people. But such speculation is, by necessity, soft and uncertain. What we know is what happened. The city rose and the city fell. The Germans brought in tanks and artillery and flamethrowers. The Luftwaffe, which seemed to have been driven from the skies weeks earlier, returned to drop bombs on the city center. The uprising turned into street by street, block by block horror. Rokossovsky watched it happen. He received the reports. He saw the casualty figures climb. 200,000 dead, 250,000. Some estimates would eventually suggest even higher numbers. The majority of them were civilians. The majority of them were killed after the uprising had become hopeless, after it was clear that no relief was coming, after the insurgents fought on not from hope but from defiance, from refusal to surrender their dignity even as their cause was being systematically murdered. And what did the Polish-born Soviet marshal feel in those nights, in that headquarters, surrounded by the machinery of Soviet power and Soviet discipline? We can wonder. We can read the careful, measured accounts that historians have written. We can note that Rokossovsky was not a man given to displays of emotion, not a man who left diaries full of his innermost conflicts. He was a professional soldier. He was a survivor. He understood that in Stalin's world, to show doubt, to show sympathy with Poland's independence, to show anything other than absolute commitment to Soviet goals, was to risk everything. He had already been tortured once. He knew what the system was capable of doing to those who stepped out of line. The historian Antony Beevor, in his meticulous account of the battle for Berlin and the conquest of Eastern Europe, suggests that Rokossovsky may have believed, or may have been told to believe, that the Germans were stronger than they actually were, that an immediate assault into Warsaw would be too costly, that supplies genuinely were stretched thin, that the military logic, however heartless, was sound. Perhaps. The mind of a commander, a survivor, a man caught between loyalty and conscience, is not easily penetrated from the outside. What we do know is this. The uprising lasted 63 days. The city was systematically destroyed. The Home Army was broken. And when the Red Army finally did cross into Warsaw, in January 1945, they entered a necropolis. Much of the city centre had been reduced to rubble. The medieval old town, which had stood for centuries, which had been the heart of Polish culture and Polish identity, had been burned to ash. The Germans had systematically destroyed it after the uprising's collapse, block by block, as a kind of final punishment, a final insult to a city that dared to hope. Rokossovsky entered that devastated landscape as a conqueror. The Soviet flag flew over the ruins. Poland had been liberated, in the official language of the Soviet state. Liberated from German fascism, certainly, but also occupied, incorporated into the Soviet sphere. Denied the independence it had fought, would always fight, 4. The Polish-born Marshal, the man who had come from Warsaw as a boy and made his way through the world, now returned to his native city as the servant of a foreign power, as the instrument through which that power would be imposed. Did he feel the weight of it? Did he understand, in some private chamber of his consciousness that we can never fully access, what price his people were paying for the victory that he helped to achieve? The question hangs in the air like smoke. It is unanswerable. And perhaps that unanswerableness is itself the point. Perhaps the deepest tragedy of Rokossovsky's life was not the torture he endured, not the false confessions he was forced to make, not even the impossible choice between loyalty to his country and loyalty to his homeland. Perhaps it was the fact that he could never, in any public way, acknowledge the conflict at all. He could never speak of Warsaw burning. He could never grieve, never question, never do anything but serve and survive. In the months and years that followed, Rokossovsky would continue to rise in Soviet favor. He would command vast armies. He would participate in operations that would reshape the map of Europe. He would be showered with honors and medals. He would be given a position of authority in Poland itself, as the chief of the Soviet-backed government's military forces. But something had changed. Something had been closed off. The man who emerged from the ashes of Warsaw was perhaps a more shadowed version of the officer who had waited across the Vistula and watched his homeland burn. The war's end found Rokossovsky in a landscape utterly transformed yet eerily familiar. He stood in a Poland that was no longer quite his own. Liberated, they said, though the word itself carried the weight of contradiction. The Soviet tanks that had driven west through Belarus now held the borders. Moscow's influence settled like snow across the Eastern European plain, and Rokossovsky, the marshal who had shed his blood and endured unspeakable suffering in Soviet prisons for this moment, was offered a strange honor: to serve as Poland's defense minister, to go home, in a manner, to lead the armed forces of the nation where he had been born, where his mother's grave lay in soil he had not seen in decades. It was, perhaps, the cruelest gift that Stalin could devise. He accepted, of course. Refusal was not truly an option for a man who had learned, in those dark interrogation rooms, that saying no to power was a form of suicide. But the position that seemed, on its surface, a restoration of dignity became instead another form of imprisonment. Not bars this time, not torture chambers. Rather, a slow, methodical extraction of his autonomy, a gentle but relentless pressure applied by Moscow through every decision he might make, every choice he attempted to exercise as a Polish commander. Poland itself was caught between worlds. The nation that had been erased, partitioned, and savaged through the war was now being rebuilt according to Soviet specifications. The Poles themselves were fractured, those who had fought with the Soviets and those who had fought against them, those who hoped for genuine independence and those who understood, with the bitter clarity that comes from proximity to power, that such hopes were now merely nostalgic dreams. Rokossovsky, by virtue of his position, became the visible embodiment of this contradiction. He was Polish, he was Soviet, he belonged entirely to neither and was claimed by both. The years between 1945 and 1949 were outwardly years of consolidation and rebuilding. Rokossovsky worked to establish a coherent Polish military apparatus, drawing on his vast experience, his meticulous understanding of organization and logistics. He was, by all accounts, a fair commander to the men under him, maintaining that core gentleness that had always distinguished him from the crueler officers of his era. But with every memo sent to Moscow, with every strategic decision cleared, or more often, not cleared, with Soviet officials, the constraints of his position became more visible. He was a figurehead, with the title of command but not its substance, a national hero who could not make his nation's decisions. This was perhaps more exhausting than imprisonment had been. Imprisonment had its clarity. You knew the enemy. You understood the rules, however brutal they were. But this slow strangulation of authority, this gradual dismantling of genuine command, while the titles and uniforms remained in place, required a different kind of endurance entirely. It required him to smile at Soviet liaisons while understanding that his every word was being reported, to give orders he knew would be countermanded, to make plans that would be unmade, to love his homeland while serving those who held it captive. The late 1940s grew steadily colder. Stalin's suspicions, which had never truly abated, began again to stir in new directions. The Soviet dictator, now that he had conquered half of Europe, grew increasingly paranoid about his own subordinates, especially those who had shown independence of mind, especially those who had connections to the nations he now ruled. A man who had survived the purges, who had been imprisoned and tortured, and somehow preserved his dignity and loyalty through that crucible, was a man who might not be entirely controllable. A Pole who commanded Polish forces, while answering to Moscow, was a man who inhabited a space of potential disloyalty. Worse still, Rokossovsky had earned genuine respect and love among the Polish people. They saw in him something lost, a native son returned, a man who had suffered and survived, who spoke their language, who understood their history. This popularity, which should have been a gift, became a liability. By 1956, in the aftermath of Stalin's death and during the brief, fragile period of de-Stalinization under Nikita Khrushchev, Rokossovsky was abruptly dismissed from his position as Poland's defense minister. The ostensible reasons were vague, couched in bureaucratic language. But the real reason was simple. He had become too influential, too beloved, too potentially independent. He was reassigned to a lesser post within the Soviet military, an exile to the periphery, a reduction in status that was designed to be felt, to humble, to remind him of his place. A man who had been a principal architect of Soviet military victory, whose strategic insights had been crucial to turning the tide against Nazi Germany, was now relegated to the margins of Soviet military life. The psychological weight of this fall must have been extraordinary, not because it was unexpected. By this point in his life, Rokossovsky had learned to expect reversals, to understand that power in the Soviet Union was always temporary, always contingent on forces beyond one's control. But because it represented a final, crushing confirmation of a truth he had perhaps hoped might prove untrue, that no amount of loyalty, no amount of military genius, no amount of suffering endured could ever truly make him safe in the world he had chosen to serve. He lived out his remaining years in relative quiet. He wrote his memoirs, carefully, mindfully, not a full unburden of soul, but a measured, somewhat circumspect account of his life. How much of what he remembered did he dare to set to paper? What could be said? What had to remain unspoken? These were the calculations that had become habitual, the constant internal editing that comes from decades of living under totalitarian scrutiny. He took assignments of decreasing significance. He faded, slowly, from public life. And somewhere in that slow fading, one might wonder what thoughts occupied his mind during the long, quiet hours. The same mind that had, under unimaginable pressure, calculated the movements of armies, that had refused to break under interrogation, that had somehow preserved its humanity through seasons of inhumanity. What does a man think about when the world he sacrificed everything for has cast him aside? When loyalty has been paid for with betrayal? When the home you fought to liberate has been denied to you? When the nation of your birth has been claimed by others? When the uniform you wore with such pride has become a symbol of occupation rather than liberation? These are not questions with easy answers, not the sort of questions that resolve neatly in the mind. They linger, they echo, they become the texture of a life. Rokossovsky had learned, long ago, that survival itself was sometimes an act of resistance. Simply enduring, continuing to exist with dignity intact, refusing to become bitter or broken, these were victories of a kind. And in his later years, when the accolades had faded and the power had evaporated, perhaps that became enough. To have lived through so much, to have seen so clearly the machinery of history and power, to have remained, in some essential sense, himself. On a quiet evening in Moscow in 1968, a man in his 70s lay in a hospital bed while snow fell beyond the window. His name was Konstantin Rokossovsky, though for years his name had been almost forgotten, erased from Soviet histories, whispered only in exile circles, a man turned phantom by the very state he had served. He died on August 23, 1968, at an age when most men had long since retreated into memory. Few outside military circles took notice. The Soviet press offered sparse acknowledgement. There were no grand ceremonies, no streets renamed in his honor during those Cold War years. He simply slipped from the living world, much as he had lived through so much of it, with a quiet dignity that asked for nothing and expected less. Yet in that stillness, in the closing of those eyes that had watched empires crumble and nations rise from ash, something essential was leaving the earth, a witness, a survivor of an age that had tried, with all its terrible machinery, to crush him into silence and dust. It is perhaps fitting that we do not know his final thoughts. The documentary record stops at the threshold of death. What does a man think about when he knows he is slipping away? Does Rokossovsky, in those last hours, remember the thunder of cavalry charges across steppe grass? Does he hear again the screams of the Lubyanka interrogation rooms? Not his own screams, but the voices of men he could not save. Does he picture the faces of soldiers whose names he ordered into history, knowing they would not come home? Or does the mind, merciful, allow it all to dissolve into something quieter, something without meaning or weight? We cannot say. We can only honor the shape of his life, the architecture of it, built as it was from such crushing materials. What remains of Konstantin Rokossovsky is not so much a name or a list of victories, though he has those. It is a pattern of behavior across decades, a single thread of consistency in an age of violent contradiction. He was a man who, when given the choice between survival through betrayal and suffering through loyalty, chose suffering. He was a commander who remembered that soldiers were men, and men deserved something more than calculation and cruelty. In an era when the Soviet military was transformed into an instrument of terror, where generals were shot for being too competent, where suspicion was currency and denunciation was survival, Rokossovsky maintained something the age tried desperately to destroy: a conscience. The Eastern Front of World War II was the bloodiest theater of human conflict ever recorded. Estimates of the total dead, both civilian and military, across the Soviet Union's wars with Germany range into the tens of millions. Into this unfathomable darkness, Rokossovsky stepped again and again. After his release from prison, weakened and uncertain whether he would live through another week, he asked to return to command, not to hide, not to preserve what was left of his life, but to help, to do what he had been trained to do. And he did it with a kind of gentle competence that seemed almost impossible in such a time. His operational victories, and they were genuine, towering achievements, were not won through the methods of terror that characterized so much of Soviet warfare. He did not rely on human wave assaults to exhaust the enemy into submission. He studied terrain, he moved supplies with precision, he trained his men, he cared about reducing unnecessary casualties. In the Soviet context, this was almost revolutionary. Officers who behaved this way were sometimes viewed with suspicion, as if humanity itself were a form of disloyalty. Yet Rokossovsky survived and rose because his methods worked, because his armies fought with discipline and morale. Because men followed him willingly, not from terror, but from respect. After the war, his life became a quieter kind of tragedy. Reassigned to Poland as defense minister, he was caught between his Polish heritage and his Russian duty, an impossible position in an age of hardening ideologies. When he was eventually dismissed, when he was finally allowed to retire, he lived with the knowledge that his nation did not fully trust him, had never fully trusted him, because of an accident of birth and a reservoir of decency that no purge could entirely drain. Perhaps there is something almost merciful in that distance from power. By the time he died, the wars he had fought were already being rewritten by men who had not survived them. History had moved on, indifferent. Yet indifference is not the same as erasure, not entirely. Rokossovsky's legacy persists in the military academies of Russia and Eastern Europe. His operational methods are still studied. Young officers learn his name not as a ghost, but as a thinker, a strategist, a man who understood the mathematics of modern warfare at a level few of his contemporaries could match. And perhaps more profoundly, his life persists as a kind of testimony to human endurance under extremity. What does it mean to remain yourself, to maintain your essential nature, when the world is systematically trying to destroy that very thing? Rokossovsky lived that question for most of his adult life. He did not always win. No man could, not entirely, but he did not surrender. In those final years of his life, in Moscow, living in relative obscurity, he would sometimes walk through the parks when weather permitted. A tall man still, even in age, with the bearing of a soldier, but the eyes of someone who had seen too much and somehow survived it. Did people recognize him? Sometimes, perhaps, among the older ones. Did he speak of the war, of the camps, of the impossible choices? The historical record is sparse. One imagines a man who had learned to hold his silence, to carry the weight of memory without pouring it onto others, not from coldness, but from kindness. Why burden anyone else with what he had endured? The snow that fell on Moscow in the winter after his death fell indifferently, as snow always does. It buried footprints. It softened edges. It made the city quiet and beautiful and temporary, as all things are temporary. Somewhere in that white silence, in that forgetting and burying, there was a kind of peace. Not the peace of recognition or vindication. Those would come later, and even then incompletely, but the peace that comes from having lived fully, from having done what could be done with the small amount of agency any of us possess, from having chosen, when choice was possible, toward decency rather than cruelty. This is the deepest legacy perhaps, not that Rokossovsky won great battles, though he did, but that he remained human in an age that had devised elaborate methods to strip humanity away, that he endured, that he did not break, that when he was given back his life, imprisoned and weakened as it was, he did not waste it on bitterness or despair, but on service, on trying to make things, if not better, then at least less terrible, on remembering that behind every military decision were men who would live or die based on that decision. That mattered to him. In an age when it seemed like madness to care about such things, he cared. And so the snow falls, and the years accumulate, and new generations arise who will never know his voice, or his face, or the sound of his footsteps in a Moscow corridor. The wars he fought fade into textbooks. The soldiers he commanded pass from living memory into history. The camps where he suffered are now museums or rubble or forgotten entirely. Everything passes, everything dissolves, but the shape of a life, the essential pattern of it, that lingers, that teaches, that whispers across the years to anyone willing to listen, endures.